Section 1. The night everything changed. Picture a Sunday evening in December of 1989. Not a dramatic Sunday, not a Sunday with anything particularly historic on the horizon, at least as far as anybody watching knew. Outside, the air carries that particular winter stillness that settles over suburban streets when the temperature has dropped and the leaves are long gone, and the holiday lights on the houses throw small, warm circles against the cold dark. People are inside. Families are finishing dinner or already arranged on sofas, blankets pulled up, the television, the brightest thing in the room. Fox Broadcasting Company, a network that had only been alive since 1986 and was still being dismissed in many quarters as a scrappy fourth-place upstart that would probably fold within the decade, was about to air something. The episode was called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire. It ran 23 minutes. It told a story about a working-class father named Homer who takes a second job as a department store Santa because he has no money for Christmas presents after his wife Marge accidentally spent their savings on laser tattoo removal for their son Bart. By the end of the episode, Homer and Bart are at the dog track, having bet their last few dollars on a racing dog named Santa's Little Helper, who finishes dead last and then gets abandoned by his owner on the side of the track. Homer and Bart bring the dog home. The family, gathered around the tree with no presents to show for the season, greets the dog with warmth and relief and something close to joy. Christmas is saved, in the loosest possible sense of the phrase. That was it. That was the beginning of what would become the longest-running scripted primetime television series in American history. A cartoon about a yellow-skinned family in a fictional town. A story about a man trying to provide for his family and failing and then accidentally succeeding in a way nobody planned. A dog named Santa's Little Helper who got 1 minute of screen time and became immediately beloved. Nothing about the premiere suggested the scale of what was coming. Fox aired it, the critics were cautiously positive, the ratings were good but not staggering. And then, over the weeks and months and years that followed, something built and built and built until it became undeniable. The Simpsons was not just a popular television show. It was one of those rare works of art that actually changes the air around it, that permanently alters what is possible in its medium, that embeds itself so deeply in the culture that its absence would leave a visible scar. By the time we are sitting here having this conversation, The Simpsons has been running for over 35 years. It has won 36 Emmy Awards. It has been nominated for 100 Emmy Awards in total. It won the Peabody Award in 1997, making it the first animated series in history to receive that honor, and it won a second Peabody Award in 2020. James L. Brooks, one of the show's executive producers, has won 22 primetime Emmys, a record for a single person, and a substantial portion of those came from his work on this show. Time magazine named The Simpsons the best television series of the entire 20th century. Not the best animated show, the best television series of 100 years. The Simpson family received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in January of the year 2000. Homer's grunt of exasperated self-awareness was added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2001. Lisa's expression of total indifference was added to the Collins English Dictionary in 2008. A made-up adjective from a single joke in Season 7 was added to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary in 2023, 27 years after a writer invented it on the spot. The Simpsons movie, released in 2007, grossed $527 million worldwide on a budget of $75 million. The show has generated over $1 billion in merchandise. University courses use its episodes as teaching tools in philosophy, economics, politics, and ethics departments at serious academic institutions. None of that was visible on that December Sunday in 1989. None of it was predictable from the outside, though perhaps some of the people making it sensed something in the work itself, something that told them they were building something that would last. 10 years after that Sunday, another show arrived. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999, following Super Bowl 33 on Fox, one of the most valuable television slots that exists. It arrived louder and more confident than The Simpsons had. It arrived with a clearer sense of its own identity, a format it had already perfected in its creator's mind, a comedy structure unlike anything that had preceded it. For a while, it was genuinely brilliant. For a while, the conversation about whether it might rival or even surpass The Simpsons was at least alive in certain corners of the internet and certain television criticism circles. That conversation has quieted considerably over the years. And this, over the course of many hours together on this quiet night, is the story of why. This is not a simple story of one show being good and one show being bad. Both of these shows were genuinely great at their respective peaks. Both of them contributed real things to the history of animated comedy, to the culture of television, to the way people laugh and communicate and understand the world around them. The conversation worth having is not about dismissal. It is about depth. It is about what each show was built from, what each show was built for, and what each show left behind when the noise around it finally settled. So, let's settle in. Let the room get quiet, let the night do what nights do, and let's talk about two shows that changed television, one of which changed something in you as well, even if you didn't notice it happening. This is a long one. This is the kind of script that is designed to carry you through the night, that asks nothing more of you than that you be comfortable and present, and willing to let the ideas wash over you, the way quiet conversations do when the world outside has gone dark and still. If you fall asleep somewhere in the middle, that is not a failure. That is the whole point. And when you wake up and find the voice still going, come back in, we'll still be here. Before we go any deeper, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely want to know. I love picturing everyone. And if you're not subscribed yet, it's free and it means a lot. Now, let's keep going. Section 2. How The Simpsons was actually built. Every enduring structure begins with someone deciding what the foundation will be made of. You can dress up a weak foundation with ornate exteriors and nobody will know it's weak until the weight accumulates and the cracks start showing. The Simpsons has been carrying enormous weight, cultural, commercial, creative weight, for over 3 decades, and it has not collapsed. The foundation was built right. Understanding exactly how requires going back to a waiting room. Matt Groening, in 1987, was a cartoonist who had been drawing a comic strip called Life in Hell since the late 1970s. Life in Hell ran in alternative newspapers and had developed a devoted underground following, but it was not a mainstream property. It was weird, dark, introspective work, comics about rabbits and fez-wearing figures exploring alienation and anxiety, and the general feeling that adult life was a trap that had been set for you before you were old enough to understand it. Groening was in his mid-30s, living in Los Angeles, and he had been invited to a meeting at the office of James L. Brooks, a television producer whose resume included The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Taxi, and The Lou Grant Show. Brooks wanted to develop an animated segment from Life in Hell to run as bumpers on a variety program Fox was producing called The Tracy Ullman Show. Groening sat in the lobby waiting for the meeting and realized something that changed everything. Adapting Life in Hell for animation would require him to surrender the publication rights to characters he had spent a decade building. The comic strip was his in a way that nothing else was. He couldn't hand it over, so he invented something new. Sitting in that lobby, in the time between arriving and being called in, he sketched out a family. He based them loosely on his own. He named the father Homer after his own father, Homer Groening. He named the mother Marge after his own mother, Margaret Groening. He named the sisters Lisa and Maggie after his own sisters. For the son, the boy who was supposed to carry his own name, he chose Bart, an anagram of brat, because he thought the character needed a name that was immediately a little bit rebellious. He told Brooks what he had come up with, and Brooks said yes, and the Simpsons family was born in a waiting room, sketched in a few minutes by a man who was improvising under pressure. That origin story matters. It tells you something about the show's fundamental character. The Simpsons was not developed through a committee process where a network identified a gap in its programming lineup and hired people to fill it. It emerged from a single creative consciousness making a desperate, inspired choice in a lobby, and that organic personal origin remained embedded in the work for years. The characters were based on real people. The family dynamics were drawn from life. The working class anxieties, the specific texture of a father who loves his family but keeps failing them, the patience and the quiet strength of a woman who is more capable than the life she got, these were not invented abstractions. They were observed realities that Groening and his collaborators translated into animation. The Tracy Ullman Show segments, 48 short animated clips that aired between 1987 and 1989 were rough and often strange. The characters moved in ways that look awkward by later standards. The voices were still being calibrated. Dan Castellaneta, who would voice Homer for the entirety of the show's run, was doing Homer in the early shorts with a looser inflection that gradually tightened and sharpened into the specific Homer voice that became one of the most recognized sounds in entertainment history. Nancy Cartwright, doing Bart, was already finding the character's particular energy. Julie Kavner as Marge was there from the start with that extraordinary voice, the gravelly warmth that sounds like nobody else and means nothing else. Fox ordered a full series for the 1989 season. James L. Brooks came on as executive producer and brought with him an instinct for the show that would prove crucial. He believed that the show had to work on an emotional level. Brooks had spent decades making television comedies that were grounded in real human experience, shows where the jokes grew out of the characters' inner lives rather than being imposed from outside. He insisted that The Simpsons be given genuine emotional complexity from the beginning, that Homer and Marge and the kids be people the audience could actually feel for, not just laugh at. Sam Simon was brought in as the original showrunner and head writer. Simon was one of the most gifted comedy writers of his generation, opinionated and exacting and absolutely clear-eyed about what was funny and what merely resembled funny. He assembled a writer's room that reads today like the most improbable concentration of talent ever gathered in a single television production. Al Jean and Mike Reiss, who would later serve as showrunners and who had been writing comedy together since their undergraduate days at Harvard. George Meyer, who had written for Late Night with David Letterman and who many of his peers considered the single sharpest comedic mind they had ever encountered. John Swartzwelder, a mysterious and brilliant writer who would eventually pen 59 individual episodes of the show, more than anyone else in its history, and who famously refused to attend the writer's room in person, preferring to work alone and submit scripts. Jeff Martin, John Vitti, Jay Kogan, Wallace Wolodarski, Jennifer Crittenden, and in Season 3, Conan O'Brien joined, before leaving to host Late Night. Greg Daniels joined before leaving to create Parks and Recreation and co-create The Office. The density of talent in that early writer's room is genuinely staggering when you map it out. These were not television journeymen filling space between more prestigious assignments. These were people who cared intensely about comedy as a craft, who had genuine ideas about what made things funny and what made them meaningful, who understood that the difference between a joke that lands and a joke that doesn't is often measured in single words and the precise positioning of a pause. Mike Reiss described the creative philosophy of those early seasons in an interview years later, and what he said explains more about why the show worked than any other single statement. He said the marching orders were simple: pack as much as possible into every episode. Nobody expected the show to last. This might be all they got. So they worked on every script as if it were the only one they would ever make. Every background got a joke in it. Every throwaway line got the same attention as the central punchline. Every episode got a specific emotional premise that the comedy was in service of, rather than jokes arranged around a premise that existed primarily to justify the jokes. The result of this approach was a show of astonishing density. Early Simpsons episodes typically contain more genuine laugh-out-loud moments per minute than almost any other television comedy ever made, and they achieve this density without sacrificing the emotional coherence that makes you care what happens. You laugh constantly, and between the laughs you are invested, actually invested, in what is happening to these people. Season 1 ran through most of 1990 and established the template. Season 2 refined it. Season 3 is where most fans and critics agree the show found its definitive voice. By Season 4, the show was producing what many people consider the single greatest run of television comedy in the medium's history. Last Exit to Springfield, considered by many longtime fans and critics to be the single best episode, aired in March of 1993. It's an episode about Homer accidentally becoming a union leader when he refuses to accept Mr. Burns' offer to trade the plant worker's dental plan for a beer keg because he keeps getting distracted by the phrase dental plan and forgetting why he agreed to something. The premise sounds thin. The execution is flawless. Entertainment Weekly described it as virtually flawless, the product of a series at the height of its creative powers. The comedy is dense on every level simultaneously, running as physical gag and sharp satire and genuine emotional story all at the same time, and doing it with a lightness that makes the craft invisible. Marge versus The Monorail, written by Conan O'Brien and aired in January 1993, was constructed as a parody of The Music Man, with Leonard Nimoy guest starring as himself and Phil Hartman voicing the conman Lyle Lanley with silky, menacing precision. O'Brien has said in interviews that he was actively warned by other writers that the premise was too weird to work, that a musical number about a monorail was going to alienate the audience. It became one of the most beloved episodes in the show's entire run, a piece of comedy so precisely constructed that it continues to be cited by writers and critics as one of the best examples of how to execute an absurdist premise with complete internal logic. Cape Fear, from Season 5, produced the rake gag and is broadly acknowledged as one of the funniest episodes of television ever made. You Only Move Twice, from Season 8, gives Homer a job with a supervillain named Hank Scorpio, and is so perfectly constructed that it plays simultaneously as broad comedy, sharp satire of corporate culture, and a genuinely touching meditation on the gap between the life you have and the life you almost had. These episodes were not produced by accident or by a lucky convergence of circumstances. They were the natural product of a specific approach to television comedy, one that took the craft seriously, that built its humor on a foundation of genuine emotional intelligence, and that trusted its audience to hold comedy and feeling at the same time without losing either one. The writing philosophy that drove the Golden Age shaped everything, not just the content but the texture of the experience. Watching early Simpsons, there is a feeling of density, of fullness, of something happening in every corner of every frame that is unlike the viewing experience of almost any other television comedy. You feel like you are watching something made by people who cared too much rather than just enough, and that excess of caring is in the work itself, is audible and visible in every episode, and it is what has kept those episodes fresh and funny and moving for over 30 years. That is what The Simpsons was built on. And that foundation has survived everything that has been placed on top of it in the 35 years since. Section 3. Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, and the art of making fictional people feel real. There is a test that all great fictional characters pass. The test is this. Close your eyes and imagine that character in a situation the show has never put them in. Something completely new. A conversation they have never had. A decision they have never faced. A moment of pressure or joy or grief that no writer has ever scripted for them. Ask yourself, do you know what they would do? Do you know how they would hold their body, what they would say, what they would feel? Do you know them well enough that you could write that scene yourself without losing them? Homer Simpson passes this test at a level that almost no other television character ever has. You know what Homer would do in almost any situation? Not because he is simple, but because he has been built with such precise internal consistency that his behavior has become predictable in the way that real people's behavior is predictable, not mechanical, not formulaic, but patterned in the specific ways that come from having an actual character rather than a collection of characteristics. Let's think carefully about who Homer Simpson actually is, because the surface-level Homer, the Homer of the jokes and the catchphrases and the memes, is only the beginning. Homer is a man who has failed at almost everything society measures success by. He is 38 years old and working at an entry-level position in Sector 7G of the Springfield nuclear power plant, a job he is almost certainly holding by accident, a job he falls asleep at regularly, a job in which he has caused multiple near disasters through negligence and poor judgment. He did not graduate high school the first time around. He has no professional achievements, no financial stability, no particular skills. He is, by the metrics of a culture that measures worth primarily through achievement and accumulation, a man who has not added up. And yet Homer Simpson is one of the most beloved characters in the history of storytelling because the show understood, from nearly the beginning, that the metrics of achievement and accumulation are not the metrics that matter most. Homer loves his family. Not in the way that a sitcom father performs love for the cameras. Homer loves his family the way that you only love things you are afraid of losing. with a depth that his inadequacy in every other area of his life has paradoxically made possible. Because Homer has never had much of anything else, the people in his house are everything. Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie are not a backdrop to Homer's life. They are his life, irreducibly and completely. The episode Mother Simpson from Season 7 makes this plain in a way that almost nothing else in the show's history does. Homer discovers that his mother, Mona, played with extraordinary warmth by Glenn Close, who he was told had died when he was a small child, has actually been alive all this time, hiding from the authorities after participating in a protest against Mr. Burns in the 1960s. The episode is funny in many places, but the emotional weight of it falls in the last 2 minutes, when Burns tips off the police and Mona has to run again, and Homer watches her van pull away on a dark road outside Springfield. And then the episode just stays with him. He sits on the hood of his car under the stars, and the night comes down around him, and the music plays, and that is the end. No button, no joke, just Homer alone in the dark with the ordinary sighs of loss. It is worth pausing on this for a moment, on a night like this one, because it gets at something important about why The Simpsons is the show it is. Most comedy programs protect themselves from real grief with a joke at the end. They will take you close to something sad and then pull back and remind you it was a comedy all along. The Simpsons, in its best episodes, does not do this. It takes you to the sad thing and leaves you there because it trusts that you can hold it. It trusts that the emotional experience of sitting with Homer in that moment is not a failure of the comedy, but its fullest expression. The laughter and the sadness are part of the same gesture, aimed at the same truth, which is that life is both things at once all the time, and the most honest art reflects this without flinching. Homer's relationship with Marge is the emotional spine of the show, and it is one of the most carefully maintained love stories in all of popular culture. In an era of television comedies that treated marriage as a grinding, adversarial relationship where the punchline was always how much the spouses annoyed each other, The Simpsons made the radical choice to show Homer and Marge as people who genuinely, tenderly, sometimes desperately loved each other. There is an episode called And Maggie Makes Three from Season 6, where Homer explains to Bart and Lisa in flashback why there are no photos of Maggie anywhere in the family albums. The episode moves through the backstory of how Marge became pregnant a third time just when Homer had finally saved enough money to quit the power plant and take his dream job at the bowling alley, and how Homer had to go back to Burns, who made him wear a demotivating plaque that read, "Don't forget, you're here forever." And then the episode ends with the revelation that Homer has taken every photograph of Maggie and covered his workspace with them, so that Burns' ugly sign now reads, "Through a carefully arranged collage of a baby girl's face, do it for her." 30 seconds of screen time, no dialogue. Just Homer at his desk, surrounded by his daughter, doing the most painful job he has ever done because she is worth it. People who have seen this episode dozens of times still cannot reliably watch that ending without their throat tightening. That is what it looks like when a television show earns its emotional moments through years of careful character construction. The scene is not sad in isolation. It is sad as the endpoint of everything that came before it, as the culmination of years of understanding who Homer Simpson is and what he carries and what he refuses to let go of. Marge Simpson is an achievement that the culture has persistently undervalued, possibly because she is often the show's reactive character, the one whose responses to Homer's disasters define the emotional register of the episode. But Marge has her own interior life, her own frustrations and dreams and private sadnesses, and the show has explored all of them in ways that feel genuinely true. Marge is a woman who is smarter and more capable than the life she ended up in, and who chose that life with open eyes, and does not regret it, but who is also not blind to the gap between the person she might have been and the person she is. This is not a small or simple emotional condition. This is the condition of most of the mothers who have ever lived. The Season 2 episode Moaning Lisa, the 6th episode ever aired, is a remarkable piece of work for its moment. Lisa is depressed. She wakes up sad and cannot explain why. She goes to school sad, she comes home sad, and Marge's impulse, the impulse she inherited from her own mother, is to tell her to smile, to put on a face, to present to the world the version of herself that doesn't require anyone else to absorb or address what she is actually feeling. And then Marge watches her daughter, this child who is clearly carrying something real and heavy, and she changes her mind in the middle of giving the advice she was raised to give, and tells Lisa instead, be whoever you are. Feel whatever you feel. Don't smile unless you mean it. The reversal is small and quiet, and it happens in a single episode, and it is one of the most important things the show ever put on screen. Bart Simpson in 1990 was a genuine cultural phenomenon. The Bart Simpson t-shirt, the one that read "Underachiever and proud of it, man," was considered controversial enough that some school districts banned it. He was a symbol of something, a kid who said no to the expectations placed on him, who made mischief not out of malice but out of an excess of energy and a profound boredom with the adult world's insistence that he be smaller and quieter and more manageable than he was. Millions of children recognized themselves in Bart. Millions of adults recognized children they had known or children they had been. But the cartoon rebel, the catchphrase machine, is not all of who Bart is. There is a Season 7 episode called Bart Sells His Soul, in which Bart sells what he considers a worthless piece of paper to Milhouse for $5, only to spend the episode increasingly haunted by the sense that something is genuinely missing, that the soul he mocked as superstition is actually something real and irreplaceable. The episode ends with Bart weeping in the night, alone, praying to get his soul back. It is one of the most emotionally sophisticated pieces of writing the show ever produced, and it is centered on a character who was sold to the public primarily as a skateboarding smart-aleck. Lisa Simpson is the character who most directly carries the show's moral and intellectual ambitions, and she does so without becoming a mouthpiece or a symbol. Lisa is a real person, defined by her intelligence and her sensitivity and the specific loneliness that comes from being the most perceptive person in almost any room she enters. The episode Summer of 4 Feet. 2, from Season 7, in which Lisa reinvents herself on a family vacation as a cooler, less intensely intellectual version of herself and feels, for a brief time, what it would be like to be accepted by peers who like her for being normal, is one of the most painful and most compassionate character studies the show ever produced. It understands the specific grief of being different, not the performative grief that produces drama, but the quiet, constant grief of never quite fitting. Lisa's sadness in that episode is not theatrical. It is recognized. It is the sadness that people who were Lisa, and there are many of us, carry forward out of childhood and into every room we ever enter. The Season 5 episode, Lisa's Substitute, takes a simple situation, a substitute teacher who treats Lisa as an intellectual equal, and uses it to explore what it feels like to be an exceptionally perceptive child in an environment that has no room for your perceptions. Mr. Bergstrom, voiced by Dustin Hoffman under a pseudonym at his own request, leaves at the end of the episode and gives Lisa a note to read when she feels alone. She reads it later, in her room. "You are Lisa Simpson." That is the whole note. 4 words. And the power of those 4 words is that the show had spent 22 minutes making clear exactly how much it takes to be Lisa Simpson and how rare it is for anyone to see it and name it and give it back to her as a gift rather than a burden. Maggie, the baby who almost never speaks and communicates entirely through gesture and expression, has been given moments of genuine heroism and genuine pathos across the show's run. In the Season 5 episode, And Maggie Makes 3, the moment we have already discussed demonstrates that Maggie is not decoration, not a visual joke, not a baby-sized prop. She is the smallest and quietest and in some ways most essential member of this family, the one for whom Homer gave up his dream without hesitation, the one in whom he sees all the reasons worth staying. Now set all of that against Family Guy's Griffin family. In the early seasons, the Griffins had something real. Peter was warm and occasionally genuinely touching in his blundering loyalty to his family. Lois had a dry intelligence that made her more than just the straight woman in the household. Stewie, as the evil genius baby, was genuinely original, a character concept so bizarre and so specifically realized that it had no precedent. Brian, as the talking dog who was more human than the humans around him, had a particular kind of sadness that made him genuinely affecting. The potential was not realized. Not because the people making the show were not talented, but because the creative priorities shifted over time in ways that did not protect the characters. The comedy came first and the characters came second. And when the comedy evolved into something louder and more extreme, the characters had to follow or get left behind. Most of them followed, and in following, they became less than they had been. Peter's warmth evaporated. His stupidity, which had been endearing in the early seasons because it was accompanied by genuine love for his family, became instead a vehicle for cruelty. The early Peter had what early Homer had, the irreducible core of a good person doing his best with limited equipment, and the comedy that came from the gap between his intentions and his results was warm rather than cruel. The later Peter had none of this. He had become something else entirely, a character whose primary function was to generate chaos and whose relationship to the people closest to him had become fundamentally adversarial. He was not funny in the way Homer is funny. He was funny the way a disaster is sometimes funny, through sheer scale and unexpectedness, rather than through the warmth that makes you glad the character exists. The Griffins, taken whole, represent what happens when a show builds characters primarily as comedy delivery mechanisms rather than as people. When they are delivering comedy well, the mechanism works and you don't notice the absence underneath. When the comedy falters or when time forces a deeper engagement with who these people are, the absence becomes impossible to ignore. The Simpsons characters are not mechanisms, they are people. They have been people since that first Sunday night in December of 1989, and they will be people for as long as the show exists, and they will be people after the show ends, which is the most remarkable thing of all. Section 4. The architecture of a joke. Comedy is invisible engineering. When it works, all you feel is the laugh. You don't see the machinery underneath it, the careful positioning of the setup, the precise calculation of how much information to withhold and when to release it, the management of audience expectation across sometimes minutes or even entire episodes before the payoff arrives. Great comedy is constructed the way great architecture is constructed, with an attention to the relationship between every element, an understanding of how each piece bears weight and transfers it to the piece beside it, and a willingness to do the invisible work that nobody will ever notice specifically, but that everyone will feel in the solidity of the result. The Simpsons, in its golden age, was some of the most sophisticated comedy engineering in the history of the medium. The writers were not simply trying to generate laughs. They were thinking about what laughter is, where it comes from, what triggers it and what sustains it and what transforms it into something that stays with you after the episode ends. They were constructing comedy with the seriousness of people who understood that humor, at its highest level, is a form of truth-telling, and that the laugh is the audience's involuntary acknowledgement that the truth has landed. Consider the rake gag from Cape Fear, the Season 5 episode. In the setup of the episode, Sideshow Bob has been released from prison and is stalking Bart. The tension is real and the comedy is running alongside it. And then, in the middle of the episode, Sideshow Bob arrives at a houseboat the Simpsons have relocated to. He steps off the dock and onto something on the ground, a rake. The handle flips up and hits him in the face. He makes the sound. He takes a step. Another rake. Another hit. Again. A third time. A fourth. By the seventh rake, the audience has stopped expecting the gag to end. By the ninth, the audience has completely surrendered to what the show is doing. There is laughter, but it is not quite normal laughter anymore. It has a quality of astonishment in it, the laughter of people watching something refuse to stop and finding it funnier precisely because of the refusal. Al Jean has explained in DVD commentary that the rake sequence was padding. The episode was running short and someone suggested extending the gag. They extended it past the point where any conventional television wisdom would have stopped, and what came out the other side was not a joke that had outstayed its welcome, but a gag that had passed through welcome into something else entirely, something that was funny about commitment itself, about the show's willingness to take a single, simple thing and pursue it far past the point of reason. This is what great comedy writing produces. The accident becomes the achievement, the padding becomes the masterpiece. And the reason this is possible is that the underlying work is good enough that even the sloppiness contributes to the whole. When you are building at a high enough level, when the foundation is solid enough and the craft is real enough, the moments of improvisation and desperation don't undermine what you've built. They add to it. There is another gag from the Golden Age, this one deliberate rather than accidental, that illustrates the multi-layered construction of the best comedy in the show's run. In Last Exit to Springfield, the episode broadly considered the single best in the show's history. There is a sequence where Homer and Mr. Burns negotiate over the dental plan in a scene that begins as a straightforward comedy about Homer's inability to follow a conversation and escalates through a series of references and allusions into something almost hallucinatory. Burns makes a reference to his little chum in a tone that references Monty Python. Homer responds in a way that references The Godfather. The scene keeps adding cultural layers while simultaneously maintaining the simple comedy of Homer not understanding what is being said to him. The gag is funny on every level at once, as physical comedy, as cultural parody, as character comedy, as absurdist escalation. Each layer rewards a different kind of attention. The casual viewer laughs. The attentive viewer laughs harder. The person who caught all the references laughs hardest of all. This multi-layered quality was by design. The writer's stated philosophy was to make every scene work on multiple levels simultaneously, to write in ways that rewarded both the distracted and the attentive viewer, to never settle for a joke that only worked on one register when it could work on three. The discipline required to maintain this standard across 22 episodes of a season is extraordinary, and the fact that the Golden Age writers sustained it for 5 or 6 consecutive seasons is one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of television production. Marge vs. The Monorail, written by Conan O'Brien and aired in January of 1993, is a perfect illustration of this principle. On the surface level, it is a parody of The Music Man, the American musical about a con man who sells a small town on the idea of a brass band. This surface reading is funny and accessible even if you have never seen The Music Man, because Phil Hartman's performance as Lyle Lanley is so precisely pitched that the con man character works on its own terms without requiring the reference to land. The Monorail song, written by O'Brien and Al Jean, is genuinely catchy and funny purely as a song, without any parody layer at all. One level deeper, the episode is a satire of American civic gullibility, of the specific dynamic in which communities are persuaded to spend money they don't have on projects they don't need by smooth-talking salespeople who exploit the gap between people's desire to believe in progress and their limited ability to evaluate technical claims. This is a timeless observation about American public life, and the episode makes it with a lightness that makes the satire land without becoming preachy. You laugh at Springfield's foolishness, and then you recognize your own town in Springfield's foolishness, and the laugh becomes slightly more complicated. One level deeper still, the episode is a commentary on celebrity charisma and how it functions as a social technology that bypasses rational judgment. The residents of Springfield are not stupid people who have been tricked. They are ordinary people who have been seduced, and there is a difference. They wanted to be seduced. They wanted someone to come along and make them feel like their ordinary town could be something special, and Lyle Lanley gave them that feeling, and they chose the feeling over the facts. This is not satire about stupidity. It is satire about the human need to believe, and the ways in which that need makes us vulnerable to people who understand it. All 3 layers are simultaneously active in the episode. You can watch it as a kid and get the surface. You can watch it as an adult and get the satire. You can watch it as someone who thinks about comedy and culture and get the meta layer. The episode does not choose one of these audiences. It speaks to all of them at once. Family Guy's comedy structure, particularly in the cutaway format that defined the show's identity, worked from different premises and with different tools. A cutaway joke is a self-contained unit. A character makes a reference or a comparison. The show jumps to a short scene illustrating the reference and then returns to the main story. The cutaway does not require narrative investment to deliver its laugh. It requires only momentary attention. This is not a criticism in itself. Self-contained jokes can be brilliant. The question is what you lose when self-contained jokes become the primary mode. What you lose is accumulation. The ability of a joke to be funnier because of what came before it. The ability of a comedy moment to carry emotional weight because of the relationship between the laughing and the caring. You lose the multi-layered structure that makes the same piece of writing accessible on multiple levels simultaneously. A cutaway joke has a surface and not much underneath it. It either lands or it doesn't. The density and depth of what The Simpsons built cannot be replicated in a format that, by its nature, prevents the accumulation of meaning over time. The early Family Guy cutaways were frequently genuinely funny. The writing was sharp enough that the self-contained moments contained real wit, real comedic intelligence, real observation. But as the seasons went on and the writing room changed, and the pressure to fill each episode with an ever-increasing number of cutaways grew, the quality of the individual moments declined. The format, which at its best required sharp writing for every single unit of comedy, became a machine for generating content that resembled comedy without consistently achieving it. There is also the matter of rewatchability, which matters more than it might seem for long-term legacy. The cutaway format loses something significant on a second viewing. The surprise, which is a significant part of the joke, is gone. You know the gag is coming, you know how it ends. The element of unexpectedness that made it land is no longer present, and what remains is just the content of the joke without the pleasure of discovery. Many early Family Guy cutaways were worth watching the second time because the writing was sharp enough that the content alone was worth the revisit. But many later ones were not. The Simpsons is routinely more enjoyable on a fourth or fifth or 10th viewing than on the first, because the multi-layered construction rewards the attention of someone who already knows what is coming. You catch things you missed. You understand references you didn't get. You see background jokes you looked past. You notice the internal consistency of a character's behavior across the episode in ways that only become visible when the plot is already familiar. The show was built to reward investment, and it rewards it indefinitely. This difference in how the two shows age under repeated viewing is one of the clearest indicators of the difference in how they were built. Section 5. Heart versus Spectacle. The emotional dimension that separates these two shows. There is a kind of television that makes you laugh and then makes you empty. You watch it with genuine pleasure while it is happening. You laugh at the jokes, you follow the story, and then it ends. And you close your laptop and almost immediately it has drained away, and you are left with nothing but the memory that you were entertained. This is not a failure in any particular way. Entertainment is valuable. Laughter is valuable. You don't have to feel changed by something for it to have been worthwhile. And then there is a kind of television that does something else. That leaves a residue. That makes you sit with the last frame after the credits roll. That puts a particular image in your head that returns to you unexpectedly for years afterward, on a random Tuesday, in the middle of doing something completely unrelated, and it still means something. This is the kind of television that The Simpsons, in its best episodes, consistently made. And the reason it could make it comes down to one word: heart. The Simpsons was built with genuine heart, and this is not a vague or sentimental claim. It is a structural observation. Heart, in the context of a television show, means that the people making it actually care about the characters they have created, that they think about them as people rather than as functions, that they give those people interior lives that exist between the jokes, that they allow those people to suffer genuinely and to grieve genuinely and to love genuinely, not as occasions for comedy, but as the context that makes the comedy meaningful. When Homer sits on the hood of his car watching the stars after his mother drives away in Mother Simpson, the emotional impact of that moment is not produced by the scene itself in isolation. It is produced by everything that came before it, by years of watching Homer fail at things, years of watching him try and fall short and try again, years of understanding that underneath the laziness and the impulsiveness there is a man who wanted more and got less and has made a kind of peace with that. The sadness in the final image carries all of that history. The star-covered sky and the small, quiet man sitting alone beneath it is the emotional sum of all the episodes that preceded it. Without those episodes, that scene is just a sad image. With them, it is devastating. The episode Homer's Triple Bypass from Season 4 is a useful illustration of this principle in action. Homer has a heart attack. He needs surgery. The surgery will be performed by Dr. Nick Riviera, the catastrophically incompetent physician who charges bargain rates because the Simpsons cannot afford real medicine. The setup is comedy. The premise is comedy. But then there is a scene in the night before the surgery where Homer goes to each of his children's rooms. He tells Bart where the tools are in the garage. He gives Lisa advice about her future in terms both practical and earnest. And then he goes to Maggie's room. He picks her up. He holds his youngest child in the dark. He doesn't say anything. He holds her for a long moment and then puts her back down and leaves. No dialogue, 30 seconds. In a Season 4 episode of a cartoon, and it is, for many people who have seen it, one of the most emotionally affecting moments in all of television comedy. It works because of everything the show had built around it, because we know this man, because we understand that this baby is his whole world in the way that his oldest two children, who can speak and engage, cannot be his whole world in quite the same way. The Season 2 episode Lisa's Substitute takes a simple situation, a substitute teacher who treats Lisa as an intellectual equal, and uses it to explore what it feels like to be an exceptionally perceptive child in an environment that has no room for your perceptions. Mr. Bergstrom, voiced by Dustin Hoffman under a pseudonym, leaves at the end of the episode and gives Lisa a note to read when she feels alone. She reads it later in her room. "You are Lisa Simpson." That is the whole note. 4 words. And the power of those 4 words is that the show had spent 22 minutes making clear exactly how much it takes to be Lisa Simpson and how rare it is for anyone to see it and name it and give it back to her as a gift rather than a burden. The Season 3 episode, Lisa's Pony, explores Homer realizing too late that he missed Lisa's school performance because he was getting a beer at Moe's, and his attempt to make it up to her by buying her a pony she had always wanted. The episode is genuinely funny throughout. Homer working 2 jobs to pay for the pony, falling asleep at the register at the Quick E-Mart while still serving customers, is crafted comedy. But the heart of it is the moment when Lisa realizes that this man, this difficult and frequently infuriating man, is destroying himself to give her something she wanted. She is moved not by the pony, but by the evidence of how much he loves her, which is so large and so clumsy and so expensive that it has become its own kind of joke. A joke that is also a truth. Family Guy has its emotional moments too. This is important to say clearly and without qualification. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, in which the 2 characters are locked in a bank vault overnight and stripped of the show's usual comedic scaffolding, is genuinely beautiful television. Brian revealing that he keeps a loaded gun in his safety deposit box because he has thought about killing himself. And Stewie's response to this revelation, which is quiet and uncharacteristically gentle, is the most honest and moving thing the show ever made. It is not a typical Family Guy episode. It is the show setting aside everything that makes it typically Family Guy and trying to do something harder and succeeding. But here is what separates the 2 shows at the deepest level. Brian and Stewie feels like an exception. It feels like a detour, a brief expedition into emotional territory that the show then retreats from when the episode is over. The next episode is not different because of it. The characters do not carry what happened in that vault into subsequent episodes. The show doesn't allow the emotional honesty of that 40 minutes to change anything. The moment exists, and then it is sealed off from the rest of the show's history. In The Simpsons, the emotional moments feel like revelations about things that were always true. Mother Simpson doesn't introduce the idea that Homer has a complicated relationship with loss and absence. It crystallizes it, makes it visible for the first time with full clarity, but you recognize it as something that was always there, always informing who Homer is. The revelation doesn't feel like an addition to the character. It feels like an excavation, like the show has dug down to something that was already in the foundation. This is the difference between emotion that is inserted into a show and emotion that is earned by one. Family Guy frequently inserted emotion into episodes, particularly in the later seasons, deploying sentimentality as a structural device to vary the rhythm of the comedy or to generate goodwill in an audience that had been battered by the show's increasing reliance on shock and cruelty. The Simpsons earned its emotion through consistent investment in its characters as real people over many seasons. The difference between these 2 approaches is the difference between a photograph and a memory. The photograph shows you exactly what was there. The memory carries with it everything that surrounded it. One of these is a record. The other is an experience. The Simpsons gave its viewers experiences. Family Guy, at its best, gave them very good records. This distinction matters enormously for the long-term legacy of the 2 shows. An emotional moment that was inserted will be recognized as insertion in retrospect, will look more and more manipulative the further you get from it. An emotional moment that was earned deepens over time, accumulates meaning as more episodes are added to the context around it. Homer on the hood of his car under the stars is not the same scene for someone who has watched 20 seasons of The Simpsons that it is for someone watching it for the first time. For the longtime viewer, it contains everything, all of it. 35 years of knowing this man and understanding what he carries and what he has lost and what he refused to lose no matter what. That is what Heart makes possible. And it is why The Simpsons will be remembered differently than Family Guy, in the same way that things you actually felt are remembered differently than things you merely watched. Additional expansion content to be combined with main script. Expansion A, deeper dive into The Simpsons Season 4 and 5 brilliance. Let's slow down and actually sit inside a few of these Season 4 and 5 episodes, because rushing past them does them a disservice, and because the specific texture of how they work tells you more about the show's greatness than any general claim could. Homer at the Bat from Season 3 is an episode that shouldn't work at all on paper. The premise is that Mr. Burns recruits a team of 9 professional baseball players to play for the plant softball team, and each of those players suffers an increasingly absurd misfortune before game night, leaving Homer as the unexpected hero. That is a premise that could be executed cheaply and still be funny. But the episode is not cheap. It assembles 9 genuine professional athletes, including Wade Boggs, Roger Clemens, Jose Canseco, and Ken Griffith Jr., and gives each of them a specific and perfectly crafted misfortune. Canseco misses the game because he is helping a woman carry furniture out of her burning house, and then ends up helping her save more furniture, and more, until the house has burned completely down around them. Don Mattingly is benched by Burns for insubordination because Burns keeps insisting he has long sideburns that need to be shaved, even after they are shaved, because Burns is old enough that he cannot be sure what sideburns look like anymore. Each of these misfortunes is precisely calibrated to the individual player being afflicted. Each one takes a real person and a real public perception of that person and finds the specific comedic angle that only works for them. This is the kind of labor-intensive, personalized comedy that requires a room full of very attentive writers who have been thinking specifically about each individual target long enough to find the joke that isn't available to anyone who didn't do that thinking. You cannot make the Mattingly sideburns joke without knowing that Mattingly had a specific, somewhat idiosyncratic reputation for neatness and discipline, and that Burns's confusion about sideburns is funnier as a generational gap joke when it's applied to someone known for caring about his appearance. The joke is built from 3 different components that all have to be true simultaneously, and it works as well as it does because someone did the work to find the precise configuration. Mr. Plow from Season 4 is a study in how the show builds a whole episode around a single beautiful premise, and then finds everything that premise can do. Homer buys a snowplow and starts a snow removal business called Mr. Plow. He gets a commercial made with a jingle that has no right to be as catchy as it is. He starts succeeding. Barney Gumble enters the same business and briefly outcompetes him as Plow King. The competition escalates. The episode finds comedy in local celebrity culture, in the fragility of small business success, in the specific male ego that emerges around commercial vehicles, and the sense of identity that attaches to them. And then it ends with both of them stranded on a mountain and having to rescue each other, which is the show doing its most reliable thing, taking the competitive premise and resolving it through the friendship underneath the competition, reminding you that Homer and Barney are, in spite of everything, genuinely fond of each other. The resolution matters as much as the premise. A show that builds a conflict and resolves it with the characters still fundamentally in each other's corner is a show that cares about its characters' relationships as things worth preserving. Homer and Barney are not rivals who happen to be acquaintances. They are friends who happen to have had a rivalry, and the difference determines everything about how you feel when the episode ends. Expansion B. The specific texture of Springfield's extended cast in more detail. Sideshow Bob is worth a full exploration because he represents one of the great uses of a secondary character across a long-running series. Bob, born Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., voiced with extraordinary theatrical commitment by Kelsey Grammer, began as Krusty the Clown's put-upon sidekick, a classically trained actor and intellectual forced by economic necessity to perform in slapstick for an unappreciative audience. He hated every moment of it. When he framed Krusty for armed robbery in Season 1's Krusty Gets Busted, it was not random villainy. It was the revenge of an intelligent man who had spent years being humiliated by the circumstance of needing the employment. What the show did with Bob across many seasons is remarkable. It allowed him to become genuinely menacing, genuinely funny, genuinely sympathetic, and genuinely ridiculous by turns. And crucially, by making all of these things simultaneously true of the same character rather than oscillating between them. Bob is dangerous because he is intelligent. He is funny because his intelligence is deployed against a target as small as Bart Simpson. He is sympathetic because his genuine love of culture and high art is real and somewhat moving. He is ridiculous because he keeps stepping on rakes. The episode where Bob recites the entirety of HMS Pinafore while the family is too polite to tell him to stop is a perfect distillation of the character. His love of Gilbert and Sullivan is genuine. His pride in being able to perform the whole of it is genuine. The family's trapped politeness is genuine. And the comedy of the whole situation is inseparable from the genuine respect the show has for Bob's authentic passion, however misplaced. This is the show treating a villain with the same observational care it brings to its heroes. Chief Wiggum is another secondary character who achieves genuine depth across his many appearances. He is corrupt in the small, lazy way rather than the theatrical way, not taking bribes for malicious reasons, but simply because not taking bribes would require more effort than taking them. He loves his son Ralph with a completeness and a warmth that the show captures in brief moments that are funnier and more affecting than full episodes built around the same relationship would be. His incompetence as a police officer is so complete that it has passed beyond mere professional failure into something almost philosophical, a man who has transcended the very concept of doing the job he was hired to do. And yet Wiggum is likable. You don't want him arrested. You want him to continue existing in the specific niche he has carved for himself, because Springfield is more interesting with him in it. Ralph Wiggum, the chief's son, is a study in what can be done with a single character trait pushed to its limit and then pushed past the limit. Ralph is not merely dim. He is operating from a conceptual framework, so different from everyone around him that his utterances don't sound like misunderstandings of the world he's in. They sound like accurate reports from a different world entirely, one where his internal logic is perfectly consistent and simply doesn't overlap with ours at any point. My cat's breath smells like cat food. This is observationally accurate, in a way. I'm a stowaway, said while sitting in a cart being pushed through a grocery store by the chief. The literal thinking applied to a figurative situation produces something that is both completely wrong and completely coherent. The writers found a way to make pure non sequitur feel grounded, and Ralph became one of the most quoted characters in the show's entire history on the strength of this one quality executed with consistent precision. Expansion C. The specific ways Family Guy's format worked against itself. There is a paradox at the heart of the cutaway format's relationship to the show's long-term creative health. The cutaways were the thing that made Family Guy distinctive. They were the format that the audience identified most strongly with the show. They were the comedy tool that generated the clips, the viral moments, the shareable pieces of content that built the show's online presence and its broader cultural footprint. They were, in the commercial sense, the product. And they were also, structurally, the mechanism by which the show prevented itself from developing the qualities that would have made it great in the most enduring sense rather than just the most popular sense. A show that depends primarily on self-contained comedy units cannot build the kind of emotional architecture that makes the comedy meaningful at a deeper level. Each cutaway is complete in itself, which means it does not contribute to anything beyond itself. You cannot have a cutaway that pays off something established 3 episodes earlier, because the cutaway exists in the eternal present of the moment of its delivery. You cannot have the audience feel the full weight of a cutaway because they understand the character making it across many seasons of investment, because the cutaway is not dependent on that investment. It is designed to be funny on first contact, for anyone without context, and this design feature, which is commercially excellent, is emotionally limiting. The Simpsons' best jokes are not funny without context. The joke about Homer covering his workspace with Maggie's photos is not funny if you don't know Homer. The joke about Lisa getting the note from Mr. Bergstrom is not moving if you don't know Lisa. The joke about Barney winning a film festival with a devastating documentary about alcoholism and then immediately drinking from a beer hidden in the award trophy is not darkly hilarious if you don't know Barney. These jokes require investment to deliver their full return. They are not designed for first contact. They are designed for people who have earned them by paying attention for a long time. This design philosophy is commercially riskier. It produces shows that reward the dedicated audience more than the casual audience. but it also produces shows that the dedicated audience bonds with in ways that commercial television rarely achieves, bonds that persist across decades, and that generate the kind of emotional legacy that makes a show more than entertainment. The late Family Guy also fell into the specific trap of using the cutaway format as pacing protection. An episode that is going badly, that is losing the audience's attention, can insert a cutaway and buy itself 20 seconds of something new and surprising. This is a crutch that the format makes available, and the show used it increasingly frequently as the quality of the main episode narratives declined. The cutaways stopped being the best part of the show and became the life raft, the way the episode stayed watchable even when the story wasn't. This created a feedback loop. Weak stories produced pressure for better cutaways. Better cutaways produced less incentive to strengthen the stories. Weaker stories produced more pressure for cutaways. The Simpsons had no such escape valve. Every minute of a Simpsons episode had to earn its place through story or character or both. When an episode wasn't working, it wasn't working, and there was no format feature you could deploy to paper over it. This accountability, this absence of a safety net, kept the writers' focus on the elements that make a show enduringly good rather than immediately diverting. Expansion D. The emotional geography of the Homer-Marge relationship. There is a question that every long-running romantic storyline in fiction eventually has to answer, and it is, why are these two people still together? Not in the cynical sense of asking why they haven't broken up, but in the genuine sense of, what is it about this specific pair that makes their continued partnership make sense? What do they offer each other that they couldn't find with anyone else? The Simpsons has answered this question across 35 years with enough consistency and enough specificity that the answer feels true rather than convenient. Homer needs Marge because she is the only person in his life who has understood the actual size of his love for his family and has chosen to receive it even at the cost of receiving all the dysfunction and chaos and occasional humiliation that comes with it. Homer's love is enormous and it is clumsy and it wrecks things. Marge absorbs all of this not because she is a saint or a martyr, but because she has recognized, somewhere early in their relationship, that the love underneath the clumsiness is real, and that real love of that size is worth the cost. Marge needs Homer because he is, in spite of everything, the person who chose her. Not because she was the most convenient option or the most appropriate match or the most likely to make the responsible choice. Homer chose Marge because he loved her with a completeness and an irrationality that doesn't compute in any ledger of sensible decisions, and that kind of being chosen by someone for whom you are not the safe choice but the only choice is something that can hold a marriage together against remarkable odds. The Season 4 episode A Streetcar Named Marge explores this with unusual directness. Marge joins a local production of a musical version of A Streetcar Named Desire and is cast as Blanche, the character who suffers most visibly from the failure of anyone around her to truly see her. Homer doesn't support the production. He doesn't come to rehearsals. He barely acknowledges it. And Marge channels her frustration at Homer into her performance of Blanche's suffering until she has a breakthrough performance that gets a standing ovation. The episode is a comedy, and it is funny throughout. But its emotional core is the question of whether Marge is Blanche, whether she is a woman whose inner life goes consistently unrecognized by the person she is closest to, whether Homer's love is real enough to constitute real seeing. And the answer the episode lands on is complicated and honest. Homer does see Marge, imperfectly and intermittently and often too late, but he sees her. His understanding arrives as a kind of epiphany, produced by watching her perform, and the moment where he realizes who she is and what she carries is played with a sincerity that the comedy around it cannot undermine. He sees her. That is enough. It is not everything. But in the specific economy of their marriage, it is enough. This is the kind of writing that makes a marriage storyline feel real rather than like a plot device. The Simpsons understood that Homer and Marge were not a stable unit representing the baseline of the show. They were two specific people in a specific relationship that required work and attention and the occasional revelation, and they were willing to put that relationship under pressure in ways that made its resilience meaningful rather than assumed. Family Guy's version of this, the Peter and Lois marriage, had its moments of genuine warmth in the early seasons. But it never achieved the same level of emotional specificity about why these two particular people were together and what that togetherness costs and provides. In the later seasons, Peter and Lois's marriage became primarily a comic device, a container for various premises rather than a relationship being explored and developed. The warmth that had been present in season 1 and 2 drained away as Peter became crueler, and the show became more interested in generating conflict than in resolving it honestly. Expansion, E. What good satire looks like and how The Simpsons did it. Satire is a word that gets applied to so many different things that it has become almost meaningless as a critical descriptor. Any television show that makes fun of something or someone is liable to be called satirical, and the word becomes so broad that it no longer distinguishes between a carefully constructed critique and a joke that happens to have a target. The Simpsons, in its golden age, was doing genuine satire in the technically precise sense of the word. It was using exaggeration and humor to expose the gap between how institutions and behaviors present themselves and how they actually function, with the goal of making that gap visible in a way that straight description could not achieve. The episode Last Exit to Springfield, which we have discussed in structural terms, is also a masterwork of labor satire. The episode depicts a union negotiation with enough accuracy to be read as a document of how power relations actually function in that context. Burns' strategy of offering the workers something they don't want, but making the offer sound generous. Homer's counter-strategy of refusing to engage on those terms, not because he is strategically sophisticated, but because he is distracted, and therefore accidentally more honest than a strategist would be. The way the union's solidarity erodes when individual members are offered individual benefits. The way Burns' physical appearance becomes a symbol of how he operates. He looks frail and ancient and incapable of genuine harm, and yet he controls the economic fate of everyone in the room. The satire is also, simultaneously, a story about Homer's love for his daughter. He is holding the dental plan because Lisa needs braces. This is not a political principle. This is a father who will not let his kid go without. The comedy of Homer being accidentally politically effective because of paternal love is itself a kind of satirical observation that ordinary people sometimes produce political outcomes not through sophisticated strategy but through a stubborn refusal to let the things they love be taken from them. This is closer to how political change actually happens than most explicitly political narratives acknowledge. Homer at the bat is also satire, though of a gentler kind. It satirizes celebrity culture, the way that communities invest in the idea of celebrity without questioning what that investment means or what it costs. Springfield is so excited about professional baseball players that it can't see the human comedy playing out in front of it. Burns is so invested in winning that he misses the fact that Homer, the person he hired to be the baseline, the last resort, the worst option, is the one who comes through in the end. The satire is about the unreliability of conventional hierarchies, about the way that competence and value get misidentified when they don't come packaged in the expected forms. Family Guy attempted satire, particularly in its earlier and better seasons, and succeeded at it sporadically. But the show's satirical instincts were less developed than The Simpsons, and less consistently applied. When Family Guy satirized politics or media or celebrity, it often did so with a bluntness that stated the observation directly, rather than embodying it in the comedy, turning the joke into a lecture that happened to have a punchline attached. The Simpsons trusted that the observation would land if the joke landed. Family Guy increasingly put the observation in the text of the joke, rather than in its structure, which made the satire easier to extract but less effective as comedy. This is a crucial distinction because satire that has to explain itself is satire that has already failed at its primary task, which is to make the audience arrive at the observation themselves through the experience of the joke, rather than having it delivered to them directly. The Simpsons made its audience figure out what it was saying. Family Guy too often just said it. Expansion F. What the show's relationship with time tells us. There is something unusual and worth examining about The Simpsons' relationship with time, and it tells you something important about the show's overall design philosophy. The Simpson family does not age. Bart is 10 at the beginning of the show, and he is 10 at the end of the show. Lisa is 8. Homer and Marge are in their late 30s. This is not a naturalistic representation of how time works, but it is a perfectly sensible, creative choice for the kind of story The Simpsons is trying to tell. By keeping the characters at fixed ages, the show can explore the same relationships and dynamics indefinitely, finding new angles on the same essential truths without the distortions that would come from the characters changing in age-appropriate ways. This choice has a philosophical implication that the show has occasionally made explicit. The Simpsons is not a show about a specific family at a specific moment in time. It is a show about a certain kind of family, about the specific dynamics that arise when these archetypes are in the room together, about the eternal present of domestic life. Homer is always going to be the lovable fool who loves his family. Marge is always going to be the patient, competent woman holding things together. Bart is always going to be the rebellious kid who acts out because he doesn't have any other language for the things he feels. Lisa is always going to be the intelligent, sensitive one who is too much for the world she was born into. These are not people who can grow up without ceasing to be themselves. They are ideas as much as they are characters, and the show treats them with the freedom that that dual status gives. You can put Homer in any situation, in any year, and the result will tell you something true about Homer and the situations he gets into, because Homer is not located in a specific historical moment. Homer is a type, but a type with enough specific texture to feel like a person. Family Guy's characters are also somewhat resistant to aging, but the show never committed fully to the implications of that choice in the way The Simpsons did. The characters feel more contingent on their specific historical context, more tied to the jokes and references of the era in which they were created, and this historical rootedness makes them less portable across time. Peter Griffin in 2025 feels like a character from 1,999 inches, a way that Homer Simpson in 2025 does not, partly because Homer was never about 1,989 inches the first place. This difference in the show's relationship with time is connected to the difference in what kind of comedy each show was producing. Comedy that is rooted in the specific cultural moment, that depends on the audience knowing the references and sharing the context, is the kind of comedy that Family Guy often made and that The Simpsons was careful to avoid making too exclusively. The early Simpsons made plenty of contemporary references, but it always grounded them in observations about permanent aspects of human nature, ensuring that the joke would be accessible to someone who didn't share the reference, but who shared the underlying human experience being described. This means that The Simpsons has a kind of portability across generations that Family Guy lacks. Young people discovering The Simpsons for the first time are discovering it through the lens of the same human experiences that the original audience brought to it, and those experiences have not changed. They are still finding Homer recognizable, still finding Lisa moving, still laughing at the specific texture of Springfield, because the show was built on observations that were not time-limited. The comedy is as available to someone encountering it in 2030 as it was to someone encountering it in 1993. This is the purest expression of what it means to build something that lasts. Expansion G. The voices Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, and the humanity inside the cartoon. There is an aspect of The Simpsons' enduring power that is easy to overlook when you are discussing it in terms of writing and structure and comedy philosophy, and that is the extraordinary quality of its central voice performances. Dan Castellaneta's Homer is one of the great vocal performances in the history of recorded entertainment, not in the history of animation specifically. In the history of all recorded performance, including live action, including radio, including every medium in which a human voice has been captured and replicated. What Castellaneta does with Homer is technically remarkable and emotionally extraordinary in equal measure. The technical achievement is the consistency. Castellaneta has been performing the same character for over 35 years and has maintained the specific qualities of that performance across every change in the character's writing, every shift in the show's tone, every variation in what the scripts have asked of him. Homer's voice is precisely calibrated, the specific timbre that makes him sound foolish without being contemptible, the specific rhythm of his speech that makes his non-sequiturs feel like genuine thought processes rather than random noise, the specific quality of his laughter that makes it warm rather than mocking. These qualities have not drifted across 3 decades of performance. The emotional achievement is the range. Castellaneta can do Homer being stupid in a way that is endearing, Homer being stupid in a way that is slightly frightening, Homer being genuinely loving, Homer being genuinely sad, Homer being briefly and unexpectedly thoughtful, Homer being heroic, Homer being petty. He can do the whole register of Homer's emotional life with the same voice, And each point on that register sounds like the same person experiencing it, not like different performances placed inside the same character shell. The moment in And Maggie Makes Three, where Homer realizes what "do it for her" means, has no dialogue, but you can hear in the small sounds Castellaneta makes the specific weight of that realization, the specific quality of a love so overwhelming that its physical expression is only a catch in the breath. Julie Kavner's Marge is an equally extraordinary performance that receives less analysis, possibly because Marge is often the reactive character and reacting is invisible in a way that initiating is not. But the specific emotional palette Kavner brings to Marge is what makes the character what she is, rather than just what she does. The voice has a warmth that is not softness, a patience that is not passivity. When Marge is frustrated, the frustration is specific and it is earned, and Kavner makes sure you hear both the frustration and the love that makes it sustainable. When Marge is frightened, the fear is precise. When she is proud of her children, you feel the pride before the words arrive. The rest of the cast, Nancy Cartwright as Bart, Yeardley Smith as Lisa, Harry Shearer doing everyone from Burns to Skinner to Flanders to Ned's sons, Hank Azaria building an entire city's worth of voices from his single, multifaceted instrument, all of them at the peak of the show were doing something that is technically difficult and emotionally demanding, and they were doing it consistently enough that the performances became invisible, became simply who these characters were rather than choices made in a recording booth. Family Guy's voice cast, anchored by Seth MacFarlane performing 4 major characters simultaneously, is also genuinely skilled. MacFarlane's ability to maintain the distinctive qualities of Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, without any of them bleeding into each other, is a real technical achievement. Alex Borstein as Lois, Seth Green as Chris, Mila Kunis as Meg, all of them gave the show a consistent vocal texture that held even when the writing around them did not. But the voice performances in Family Guy were always somewhat more obviously performance, somewhat more clearly characters being inhabited by actors, than the voice performances in The Simpsons became. The Simpsons voices stopped being performances and became identities in a way that is rare in any medium, and that contributed enormously to the sense of Springfield as a real world with real people in it. Expansion H, the complete picture connecting it all. Everything we have discussed across this long night connects to a single central observation, and it is worth stating that observation directly before we reach the conclusion. The Simpsons is better than Family Guy because it was trying to do something harder and it succeeded. The attempt at something harder produced a show of greater depth, greater emotional resonance, greater cultural impact, and greater durability than a show primarily aimed at being very funny in the moment could have produced. Family Guy aimed lower and often hit its target. The Simpsons aimed higher and hit its target often enough to produce some of the most lasting work in the history of the medium. The show that aims to make you laugh and succeeds has accomplished something real and good. The show that aims to make you laugh and feel and understand and recognize yourself and see the world differently and be changed by the experience of watching it, and that succeeds, has accomplished something of a different order entirely. It has made art rather than entertainment, and the difference between those two categories is not a value judgment about which is more necessary or more worthy of attention in any particular moment of a human life. Both are necessary, both have their time and place, but only one of them is building something that lasts longer than the pleasure of the individual watching. The Simpsons built something that lasts. It built it with care and craft and a genuine love for the people it created, and it maintained that building through the decisions it made, season after season, to treat its characters as real people rather than as vehicles for jokes. The show is not perfect. It has never been perfect. It has had weak seasons and weak episodes and moments where the care slipped and the craft faltered. But the thing it was trying to build never fully collapsed, and what remains, 35 years after that first quiet Sunday night in December, is still recognizable as the thing that was always the goal. That is the final argument. The Simpsons built something that the passage of time has not been able to diminish, because it was built on things that time cannot reach. The truth about a working-class family, the truth about love that is imperfect and real and worth everything, the truth about being the smartest person in any room, and the loneliness that comes with that, the truth about being a man who has failed at everything and loves his family so completely that the failure stops mattering. Those truths were in the show in December of 1989. They are in the show now. They will be in the show when the youngest person watching this tonight is old and has watched the same episodes enough times that they know the words by heart without ever having tried to learn them. That is what The Simpsons built. And it is why, at the end of this long, quiet night, the answer to the question we've been asking is clear. The Simpsons is better. It has always been better. And the reasons it is better are also the reasons it will still matter long after the question itself has stopped feeling worth asking. Additional deep content block woven throughout the script. The physical world of animation and why it matters more than people think. There is a dimension of the comparison between these two shows that gets almost no attention in the conversations most people have about them, and that is the question of how each show uses animation as a medium rather than simply as a delivery system for its scripts. Animation is not just a cheaper alternative to live action. It is a fundamentally different medium with its own expressive possibilities and its own particular relationship to reality, and the degree to which a show understands and uses those possibilities is part of what determines whether the show is doing something genuinely cinematic or merely transcribing. The Simpsons, in its golden age, used animation with a sophistication and an intentionality that elevated the work above what the scripts alone could have achieved. The show's backgrounds during the Golden Age were painted with a specific quality of light and depth that made Springfield feel like a place that existed in 3 dimensions, even when nothing in the foreground required that depth. The backgrounds were not simply settings. They were tonal environments. They told you something about the emotional register of the scene before a character had said a word. The episode You Only Move Twice, in which the Simpsons move to the planned community of Cypress Creek, where Hank Scorpio runs his global domination operation, uses the visual contrast between the show's normal aesthetic and the clean, bright, corporate perfection of Cypress Creek to do something that words couldn't do alone. Every building in Cypress Creek is slightly too perfect. The colors are slightly too saturated. The proportions are slightly too ideal. The animation is doing the work of establishing this place as the kind of utopia that is, on examination, unsettling, because utopias always are. The visual language of the episode earns the eventual reveal that Scorpio is destroying world governments, partly because the place he has built looks like it was designed by someone who doesn't understand human imperfection, who has never needed to live in a place that bears the marks of actual use. Homer's reaction to Cypress Creek, which is delight and belonging, tells you everything about what he needs. He needs a place that sees him as adequate, and Scorpio's operation, which assigns him tasks he can actually accomplish, fills that need. The comedy of Homer being a genuinely useful employee of a supervillain is inseparable from this visual context. He fits here. He didn't fit in Springfield, not quite, not entirely. Here the paths are clear and the assignments make sense and someone thinks well of him. The animation of Cypress Creek's brightness is doing the work of Homer's happiness in a way that dialogue couldn't. Family Guy's animation through most of its run was functional rather than expressive. The backgrounds existed to establish location rather than to participate in the emotional life of the scene. Characters moved through spaces that were clearly designed rather than observed, that had the generic quality of visual shorthand rather than the specific quality of a place that someone has thought about in the way that artists who love places think about them. This is not a condemnation. Television animation is expensive and time-consuming, and every production must make choices about where the resources go. But the choice to use She Was backgrounds as location indicators rather than as emotional environments is a choice with consequences for how the show feels. The specific quality of The Simpsons' character animation during the Golden Age also contributed to the show's distinctive emotional range. The characters could perform a wide range of physical expression, from broad slapstick to subtle shifts in posture and expression that communicated something interior without needing dialogue. The animators, working with the directors to bring specific scripts to specific visual life, understood that a slight change in the angle of Homer's head or the position of his hands communicated things about his emotional state that the dialogue was not saying. This partnership between the writing and the animation is what made the show greater than either element alone would have been. The scripts gave the animators characters with enough depth to be worth rendering with care. The animation gave the scripts a physical dimension that made the characters feel embodied in a way that pure dialogue could not. The problem with laughter that has no memory. One of the things that separates great comedy from very good comedy is whether the laughter it produces has any memory attached to it. Does laughing at the joke leave any residue? Do you remember the day after watching why something was funny? Can you describe the joke to someone else and find that the description itself is funny rather than merely a list of the elements that produced the laugh when they were assembled? The best Simpsons jokes are describable. Not just the premise, but the specific way the joke was constructed, the timing of the reveal, the exact words that made it land. People who love the show can argue for hours about the single funniest joke in the show's history, and every candidate they raise is describable, has specific craft elements that explain why it works, is funny in the telling as much as in the original viewing. I am so smart. SMRT, Homer, having just burned his high school diploma in self-congratulation and watching the fire spread to the curtains. The joke is the misspelling. The misspelling is perfect because it confirms, in the act of celebrating intelligence, the absence of intelligence being celebrated. The self-defeating structure of the joke is its entire content. You can describe it in one sentence, and the description is funny. The episode Homer the Great, from season 6, in which Homer accidentally becomes the leader of a secret society called the Stonecutters, and then is told he is their chosen one, and immediately ruins the society through an excess of egalitarian enthusiasm, is a complete, self-contained satire of how institutions respond to true believers. The joke is that the thing the institution claimed to want, someone who would truly live its values, is the thing that destroys it, because the institution never actually wanted its values lived. The description of this premise is itself a satire of every professional organization that has ever claimed to have values it didn't mean. You can describe the episode in 2 sentences, and the 2 sentences are a complete satirical thought. The best Family Guy jokes, by contrast, are harder to describe without losing them. The comedy of a cutaway depends in significant part on the surprise of the cut, on the unexpectedness of landing in a particular place for a particular reason. The description of a cutaway tells you what happened, but not what the experience of the cut felt like, and the experience of the cut is a large part of the joke. And then it cuts to a scene where already establishes distance from the thing being described, Homer then says. Does not establish the same distance because Homer is not the surprise. You know Homer. The joke is what Homer does, and what Homer does is describable in ways that communicate the joke rather than just referencing it. This difference in describability is related to the deeper difference in what each show's comedy is built from. Comedy built from character and observation and truth is describable because the description conveys the truth. Comedy built from format and surprise is less describable because the format and the surprise are experiential rather than propositional. You can't transfer the experience of a cut in a description. You can transfer the truth that a joke contained. The Simpsons gave you jokes you could carry with you. Jokes that fit into the ongoing conversation of your life because they were about permanent things that you could reach for when something in your own experience reminded you of them. The experience of watching something unfold in a way you should have predicted but didn't produces a Homer-shaped DO in your head, and you produce it without thinking about the show or the character because the word has left the show and become part of how you process a certain kind of moment. That is comedy that has become part of you. Family Guy gave you laughs that were generous and real in the moment and then faded. This is not nothing. This is real pleasure, genuinely given. But it does not accumulate into the ongoing conversation of a life the way The Simpsons jokes do. On the subject of guest stars and what they tell you about each show's priorities, both shows have made extensive use of celebrity guest voices throughout their runs, but the ways they have used those guests reveal something important about what each show was actually trying to achieve. The Simpsons' best guest appearances were always in service of the episode's story and themes, chosen because something about the celebrity's public persona or the character they would be playing could add a dimension to the episode that a fictional character couldn't. Michael Jackson voicing a large white man who believed he was Michael Jackson, who turned out either to be exactly who he said he was, or to be someone whose sincere belief in his own identity was functionally indistinguishable from the real thing, was a comic and philosophical choice that made the episode richer. Albert Brooks as Hank Scorpio, voicing a supervillain with the specific, warm, encouraging energy of a Silicon Valley motivational speaker, was perfect casting because it identified something true about how real power sometimes presents itself. James Brown as the narrator for the Homer Goes to College episode, bringing the voice and the energy of a funk legend into a story about college antics, was an absurdist choice that worked precisely because of how wrong it was and how the wrongness kept producing new comedy rather than just one establishing joke. The guest appearances in these episodes are woven into the episodes. They don't exist outside the story. They aren't celebrity appearances packaged as a separate attraction from the episode itself. They are integral to what the episode is doing. Family Guy's guest appearances, particularly in the later seasons, became increasingly promotional, increasingly oriented toward the celebrity's current projects, increasingly disconnected from the episode's nominal stories. The show would accommodate a celebrity appearance by building an episode around a premise thin enough to require the celebrity's presence at its center, rather than finding celebrities whose specific qualities served specific stories the show was trying to tell. The result was a series of episodes that felt like the celebrity was the point, where the story existed to justify the appearance rather than the appearance existing to serve the story. This difference is not trivial. It reveals what each show understood about itself and its relationship to its audience. The Simpsons understood that its audience was there for The Simpsons, for Springfield, for the ongoing story of these characters, and that a celebrity guest appearance was something to be earned by the episode rather than a reason for the episode to exist. Family Guy increasingly understood that its audience was there for spectacle, and that a celebrity guest was a spectacle that could sustain an episode even if the episode itself was not particularly good. The show that knows its audience is there for the characters will always develop those characters with more care than the show that knows its audience is there for novelty, because character development requires sustained investment rather than the perpetual provision of new things. The Simpsons invested in Springfield's people, and that investment paid dividends across decades. Family Guy invested in novelty and the dividends, while real in the short term, proved unsustainable. The question of what television comedy is actually for. We have been talking for many hours about craft and character and comedy philosophy, and there is a question underneath all of it that is worth surfacing directly. What is television comedy actually for? What are we, the audience, hoping to receive when we sit down with a comedy show? The obvious answer is laughter. We want to laugh. Laughter is pleasurable, is physically good for us, is a form of release from tension, and a form of connection to the people laughing with us. A show that makes us laugh has done something real and good, and no analysis of craft or structure or emotional depth should obscure this basic truth. But I think most of us, if we are honest with ourselves, want more than just the laughter. We want the laughter to mean something. We want to feel, when an episode ends, not just that we were entertained, but that we spent time with something. That the time was given over to something worthy of it. Something that left more than a blank space where the laugh used to be. This is why we have feelings about television shows in the way we do. Not just preferences, but genuine emotional investments. Shows we feel protective of. Shows we miss when they end, or when they change, or when we outgrow them. Shows that feel like they belong to a particular period of our lives in a way that is specific and irreplaceable. The Simpsons, at its best, understood this more completely than almost any other television comedy ever has. It understood that the audience was coming to it with their whole selves, carrying their families and their jobs and their fears and their specific ways of loving people, and it built a show that could absorb all of that and reflect it back in ways that were both funny and true. It built a show that could be the thing you put on with your family on a Sunday night when you needed something warm. It built a show that could be the thing you put on alone at 2 in the morning when you needed to feel less alone. It built a show that worked differently at different ages and in different circumstances, and kept working, kept producing the specific kind of pleasure that comes from spending time with something that knows something true. Family Guy, in the end, did not understand this quite as completely. It built a show that knew how to make you laugh, and did it consistently and sometimes brilliantly. But it did not build a show that felt like it knew you. It did not build a show that you could put on when you needed to feel understood and reliably feel that way. It built a show that was very good at producing laughter. It built a show that was good at entertaining you in the moment. And those are real achievements, truly. But The Simpsons built something else. Something that answers a need deeper and more persistent than the need for laughter. It built a show that felt like home. And that is why, on this quiet night, wherever you are watching from, and whatever time it is there, it is the better show. Not just technically, not just critically, but in the deepest sense, the sense that asks what a piece of art actually gives you when you sit with it in the quiet of your own life. The Simpsons gave people a home for 35 years and counting. That is what The Simpsons built. And nothing else in this comparison matters more than that. End of additional content. The writers who made Springfield real, a deeper look at creative genius in a room. Let us spend more time in that writer's room because it deserves the attention. The early Simpsons writing room is one of those rare environments in creative history where the right people found each other at exactly the right moment, and the result was something that none of them could have produced alone. Understanding it better helps explain why the show achieved what it did, and why replicating those conditions has proved so difficult. George Meyer is probably the least famous of the Golden Age writers outside of television industry circles, and he may be the most important one. Meyer, who had previously worked on Late Night with David Letterman and written for various other programs, brought to The Simpsons a sensibility that one colleague described as the funniest person any of us had ever met, and also the most demanding. Meyer's specific gift was finding the precise angle on any observation that made it funny rather than merely true. He was known for sitting with a joke long after most writers would have moved on, looking for the version of it that was not just accurate but inevitable, the version where the words were exactly right and no substitution could improve them. The joke about Springfield's nuclear plant having a broken sign above the safety alarm that reads "Danger" is Meyer level. The word "danger" has been on the sign long enough that the sign itself is broken, meaning the danger is so chronic and so accepted that the warning infrastructure has simply stopped being maintained. It is one observation compressed into 2 words on a broken sign, and it tells you everything about the specific kind of institutional negligence that is endemic to every organization large enough to have stopped being afraid of its own failures. A lesser writer would have made the joke about the broken sign explicit in dialogue. Meyer trusted the sign to do the work. This compression is a defining quality of the best Golden Age writing. The show did not over-explain its observations. It placed them in front of the audience and trusted the audience to be smart enough to receive them. The relationship between the show and its audience during those years was fundamentally different from the relationship between most television comedies and their audiences, which is typically organized around the assumption that you have to explain the joke or the audience will miss it. The Golden Age Simpsons assumed the opposite, that the audience was capable of the same intelligence the show was demonstrating, and that they would not only keep up but would be rewarded for keeping up with something that met their intelligence rather than managing it. John Swartzwelder's contribution deserves further unpacking too. He wrote 59 episodes, nearly double the next most prolific writer, and his style had qualities unlike anyone else on the staff. He wrote in a kind of rigorous absurdism that found the logical extrapolation of any premise, and then pushed it past where logic nominally ends, into territory that was both unexpected and, on reflection, completely consistent with where the logic was heading all along. An episode about Homer fearing old age becomes an episode about the nature of fear itself and the ways we construct beliefs to protect us from our fears. An episode about Springfield establishing a bear patrol becomes an episode about how communities generate political solutions that cost more than the problems they solve. The premise is always the premise, but the destination is always somewhere the premise implies without obviously requiring. Swartzwelder also had a gift for dialogue that sounded wrong in a precisely right way. His characters spoke in a register that was slightly off from naturalistic speech, slightly more formal in unexpected places and slightly more crude in places where formality would be expected, and the resulting dialogue had a texture that was immediately recognizable as his. You could often identify a Swartzwelder episode within its first minute simply by the quality of the words in the characters' mouths. The concentration of these different kinds of genius in one room meant that any script coming into the room got exposed to multiple different standards simultaneously. Meyer would push on the precision of the observation, Swartzwelder would push on the internal logic of the premise. O'Brien, during his time there, would push on the musicality of the language and the structural elegance of the plot. Reese and Gene would push on the overall coherence of the episode as a unified piece and its consistency with the show's emotional register. The script that survived this process had been tested against multiple exacting standards and had to satisfy all of them, which meant that the finished product was as good as the combination of those standards could make it. This is the kind of quality control that produces masterpieces. Not because any individual in the room is uniquely gifted, though several of them were, but because the combination of different gifted people applying different standards to the same material generates a pressure that makes the material stronger than any one of them could have made it alone. Seth MacFarlane's writer's room in the early Family Guy seasons was not without talented people. David Zuckerman, who served as a co-showrunner in those early seasons, was a skilled comedy writer whose understanding of the show's voice was sophisticated. The writing staff that produced the first 3 seasons had real ability. But the room was organized primarily around MacFarlane's vision, in a way that the Simpsons room was not organized primarily around any single person's vision. The Simpsons room had Sam Simon as its authority, but the culture Simon created was one in which everyone's best idea could win, in which the script's quality was the ultimate standard rather than any individual's preference. MacFarlane's room produced work that reflected MacFarlane's sensibility very clearly, which meant that when MacFarlane's attention was fully on the show, it was very good, and when it wasn't, it had less inherent direction to fall back on. The language The Simpsons gave us a fuller accounting. We have mentioned dough and meh and cromulent, but the linguistic legacy of The Simpsons is richer than even these famous examples suggest, and examining it more fully reveals something important about the nature of the show's impact. When a piece of fiction contributes words to the living language, it is doing something that very few works of art ever manage. The words that stick are not the ones that are merely clever or memorable. They are the words that fill real gaps, that give people a way to say something they were already feeling or thinking or observing, but did not have precise language for. D.O. fills the gap for a specific flavor of self-reproach that is not quite frustration with circumstances and not quite anger at oneself, but exactly the feeling that results from realizing that an outcome you could have predicted has come to pass. The sound itself captures the feeling in a way that any synonym would fail to. Damn it is too angry. Shoot is too mild. Of course is too resigned. D.O. is exactly the flavor of exasperated, slightly self-amused recognition of one's own predictable failure. There was no word for this before Homer gave it one. Meh carries a similarly precise shade. It is not mere indifference. It is a particular kind of indifference that contains within it a judgment. The thing being dismissed is not worth the energy of a more complete response. It is contempt expressed as inertia. Dismissal expressed as barely audible noise. This combination of indifference and low-grade contempt is something that English speakers were apparently experiencing without having the right sound for it. And when Lisa Simpson produced it in the right context, people recognized it instantly and started using it within what felt like days. It was already true. The show just named it. The Simpsons Did It phenomenon, which spawned the South Park episode where it is explicitly addressed, is another form of the same thing. The cultural resonance of the show had become so complete that any creative premise that appeared to resemble something in the show's 30-plus-year history would immediately be connected to it. The show had become a kind of cultural standard against which other things were measured, a baseline for American popular culture that everything else existed in relation to. You can criticize Simpsons Did It as a lazy form of criticism, and it often is. But the underlying reality it reflects, which is that the show's creative territory is so large and so thoroughly explored that it genuinely overlaps with almost everything else in popular culture, is a testament to the scale of what was built there. The academic books that have been written about The Simpsons in relation to philosophy, economics, ethics, political science, and other disciplines are doing something more serious than pop culture analysis. They are making a claim that the show's engagement with its subjects is sophisticated enough to be in dialogue with serious academic thought about those subjects, that the show's observations about power and class and family and morality are accurate enough and penetrating enough to serve as teaching tools for people learning those subjects formally. This is not a claim anyone has made about Family Guy, and the absence of such a claim reflects a real absence in the show's relationship to the world it was observing. The specific comedy of sadness, why The Simpsons earned its tears. There is a specific kind of comedy that only becomes available to a show that has done the work to earn genuine emotional investment from its audience, and it is the comedy that comes from holding sadness and laughter at the same moment. Not the deflecting comedy that uses a joke to avoid a feeling, and not the sentimental comedy that uses feeling to earn a laugh, but the comedy that is both things simultaneously that finds the humor in the honest depiction of pain. The Simpsons did this more consistently and more successfully than almost any other television comedy, and it is one of the clearest demonstrations of the depth the show was operating at. The Season 7 episode, Bart on the Road, is a funny episode about Bart getting a fake driver's license and taking a road trip with Milhouse, Nelson, and Martin. It is light and episodic and generates lots of laughs. But inside it is a small scene where Lisa, who has been left out of the adventure and has been spending time with Homer instead, tells Homer something about what it would mean for her to work at a nuclear facility, and Homer responds with a warmth and a seriousness that the episode has not prepared you for. And for 30 seconds, the show is doing something entirely different, holding you in a quiet moment between a father and a daughter that has no comic armor around it at all, and then returning to the comedy as if the moment hadn't happened. The moment is not undermined by the comedy before and after it. It is deepened by it. The comedy creates a context in which the quiet moment feels earned rather than manufactured. The Season 5 episode Deep Space Homer, which sends Homer to actual outer space aboard a NASA shuttle, is primarily a broad comedy about Homer's inadequacy in a professional context. But it contains a moment when Homer is looking down at Earth from orbit and says quietly, "I can see my house." That works as something more than comedy. It works as the specific emotion of a man who has been given something astonishing and whose response to the astonishment is to locate in it the one thing that matters most to him: his house, his family, the small domestic world that is everything he has and everything he needs. The comedy and the tenderness are inseparable there. The joke is that his response to being in space is so characteristically, irreducibly, Homer. The tenderness is that this specific response is, in its own way, beautiful. This dual register, the simultaneous comedy and feeling, is something that Family Guy attempted but did not achieve with the same consistency. When Family Guy aimed at it, it usually landed on one side or the other. Either the comedy deflated the feeling, or the feeling displaced the comedy, and the episodes that tried for both often felt uneasy about which one they wanted to be. The Simpsons' confidence in holding both things at once came from the depth of investment in the characters, which created an emotional reserve that the comedy could draw on without depleting. The night itself, a return to where we started. Picture the same Sunday evening in December of 1989, seen from a slightly different angle. See not just the family on the couch and the television in the corner, but the people who made the thing playing on that television. See Matt Groening, who sketched a family in a lobby and gave them the names of his own relatives, who had no way of knowing he was making something that would outlast almost everything else created in that decade. See James L. Brooks, who had spent a career insisting that comedy could be emotionally honest, and who saw in this rough animated family the possibility of something that would finally prove him right at a scale he hadn't imagined. See Sam Simon, who assembled the room and set the standard, and whose contributions to the early show are still visible in every Golden Age episode, even though his role in it ended after Season 4. See the writers who stayed up too late finding the right word, the exact configuration of syllables that would produce the response they were aiming for. All of them building something, working towards something they could feel but not entirely see, producing episodes that they hoped would be good enough to justify another season, not knowing that those episodes would still be watched 35 years later by people in circumstances they could never have imagined, in countries they may never have visited, through technologies that did not yet exist. The show that resulted from all of that effort and all of that talent and all of that care is not perfect. No work of art that has been running for 35 years is perfect, but it is something rarer than perfect. It is real. It is a genuine encounter with real human experience, rendered in bright colors and cartoon physics, told through the lives of a yellow-skinned family in a fictional town, and it has been waiting for you on whatever evening you needed it. On the evenings when you needed to laugh, on the evenings when you needed to feel something true, on the evenings when you needed to be reminded that love is real and families are worth the work, and that even the most ordinary life contains moments worth preserving. That is what The Simpsons gave us. That is the full measure of what it built. And that is why, on this long, quiet night, having looked at the question from every angle we could find, the answer is the same it has always been. The Simpsons. Better show and worth every hour. End of script, full document. The matter of consistency. How many great episodes is enough? When people debate the peak of The Simpsons versus the peak of Family Guy, they are often debating different things without realizing it. Some people are thinking about individual episodes, about the single funniest half hour each show ever produced. Others are thinking about sustained runs, about which show maintained its quality across the most consecutive episodes. Others are thinking about depth, about which show's best work has the most to offer on repeated engagement. These are genuinely different questions and they have different answers. And part of the reason the debate persists is that people are answering different questions and talking past each other as a result. Let me try to address all three. On individual episodes, the honest answer is that the very best single Family Guy episodes, Brian and Stewie, Road to the Multiverse, Back to the Pilot, some of the early Brian and Stewie Road episodes, are genuinely excellent pieces of television comedy. They are inventive, well-constructed, emotionally surprising in places, and funny with a consistency that challenges the claim that the show was never capable of great work. If you put any one of these episodes against any one mediocre Simpsons episode from season 17, the Family Guy episode wins. There are mediocre Simpsons episodes. Plenty of them. The individual comparison, episode by episode, is not as lopsided as partisans sometimes suggest. On sustained runs, the comparison shifts dramatically. The Golden Age Simpsons sustained a quality across approximately 5 to 6 seasons that has no equivalent in Family Guy's history. The period from roughly season 3 through season 8, with some disagreement about the end boundary, produced episode after episode that was not just good but genuinely great, that achieved what only the best television ever achieves, which is a complete and fully realized creative vision executed at a consistently high level across an extended period of time. Family Guy never had a 5-season run of anything approaching this consistency. Its best sustained period was probably seasons 4 and 5 of its post-revival run, and that run produced many good episodes and some great ones, but nothing like the wall-to-wall achievement of The Simpsons' Golden Age. On depth, the comparison is most lopsided. The Simpsons, at its best, was operating at multiple levels simultaneously, producing work that rewarded close attention and repeated viewing in ways that Family Guy's best work does not. The complexity of the comedy, the multi-layered structure of the best episodes, the emotional architecture built across seasons, all of this gives the show a depth of field that means looking at it closely always reveals more. Family Guy's best work is enjoyable and funny and sometimes moving, but it does not have the same relationship with close attention. Looking more carefully at a great Simpsons episode makes it better. Looking more carefully at a great Family Guy episode mostly just confirms what you already saw. The final quiet thought. There is a specific feeling that accompanies the experience of something you love that you know is impermanent, or that is changing, or that cannot stay exactly what it was at its best. The feeling is bittersweet, and it is one of the most distinctly human emotional registers. The awareness that beauty and time are in tension, and that time will eventually win. The Simpsons has been giving people this feeling for over 30 years now. Not because the show is ending, though presumably it will end eventually, but because the show's peak was something that everyone who experienced it at the time knew, on some level, was not going to last. The Golden Age was a gift, and like most gifts, it carried within it the knowledge that it would not always be there in quite this form. That knowledge made the gift more precious, not less. Family Guy does not produce this feeling in the same way, or at least not for the same reasons. People miss the early Family Guy when they think about it, but the missing is more like nostalgia for something that was fun than like the ache for something that was genuinely irreplaceable. The early seasons were good. They were better than what came after, but they did not achieve the status of something that people felt they had been trusted with, something that demanded their full attention and gave back more than they brought to it. The Simpsons, at its best, demanded your full attention and gave back more than you brought. That is the final measure. That is what great art does and what entertainment, however wonderful, cannot reliably do. And it is why this conversation, at its heart, has always had the same answer. Good night, wherever you are. Thank you for staying this long. The night is quieter now. Let it carry you the rest of the way. The Simpsons and the American Dream one more angle. There is a reason that The Simpsons resonates so deeply across so many different kinds of Americans, across generations and geographies and economic circumstances, and it has to do with the show's relationship to the American dream. Not the triumphalist version of that dream, the version where ambition meets opportunity and the deserving succeed. But the quieter, more honest version, the version that most people actually live, where the ambition is modest and the opportunities are limited, and success is defined not by ascent but by sustaining the things you love. Homer Simpson is not a man who achieves the American dream in any of its conventional forms. He does not rise from humble beginnings to wealth or power or recognition. He does not discover a hidden talent and find his true calling. He does not become the man he thought he would be when he was young enough to have those kinds of thoughts. He stays in Sector 7G. He stays in the house at 742 Evergreen Terrace. He stays the same imperfect, loving, frequently failing, occasionally heroic version of himself that he was when the show began. And yet Homer Simpson is, in a very specific and genuinely important sense, a portrait of the American dream. Not the dream as propaganda, but the dream as actual aspiration, the aspiration that underlies all the more glamorous versions. I want to have a family. I want them to be safe. I want them to know they are loved. I want to provide for them as best I can. I want, when I am gone, for the people I love to remember that I tried. Homer tries. He fails regularly and spectacularly. He tries again. The trying is the whole of his life, and the show honors it as such. It does not mock him for failing to be more than he is. It finds in his limitations the specific human dignity that belongs to everyone who loves with their whole imperfect heart and keeps showing up anyway. This is what the show gives its audience that nothing else gives them in quite the same way. The permission to be ordinary, the validation of ordinary love as something worth telling stories about, worth spending 35 years of creative effort on, worth an audience of millions across decades and continents. The Simpsons looked at a working-class family in a fictional American city and said, "This is worth the full attention of our best writers, our most talented animators, our most careful storytellers. This ordinary life is interesting enough. This love is large enough. This family is worth it." That is the deepest gift the show gave, and it is the one that will outlast everything else about it. A brief note on what we just did together. If you listen to all of this, if you followed the argument from the waiting room in 1987 to the final image of Homer under the stars, then you did something that takes a particular kind of willingness. You sat with a long, careful, serious conversation about something that many people dismiss as just a cartoon, and the fact that you were willing to do that says something about why you are here, on this kind of channel, on this kind of night. You are here because you believe, the way this conversation has tried to argue all along, that the things we love deserve to be thought about carefully. That the shows we grew up watching and the shows we still return to are not trivial objects. That art in any medium, even a cartoon that has been running for 35 years and has had more weak seasons than strong ones by now, can mean something real and lasting, can tell us something true about who we are and what we carry, and what we are trying to do with the short, improbable time we have. The Simpsons told us that. Family Guy tried to, in its early seasons, with real seriousness and real success. And the comparison between them is worth making not because one show deserves to be diminished, but because understanding what made one great helps us understand what greatness in this medium actually requires. It requires intention, it requires craft, it requires care, and it requires the willingness to trust that ordinary human experience, rendered with full attention and genuine love, is interesting enough to build a lifetime of stories around. Section 6. Springfield Building. A world that breathes. A great fictional world is not a backdrop. This point cannot be made strongly enough, because the distinction between a fictional setting that functions as wallpaper and a fictional setting that functions as a living space is the distinction between a show that produces good individual episodes and a show that produces a sustained, coherent creative universe that can accommodate virtually any story. Springfield is one of the great fictional worlds in the history of storytelling, not just in animation, not just in television. In storytelling as a broad category, it belongs in conversations with Yoknapatawpha County, with Middle-earth, with Dickens's London. These are the fictional places that function as fully realized alternative realities, complete enough to feel lived in, complex enough to generate stories from their own internal dynamics, rather than requiring new premises to be imported from outside. Matt Groening has said that he named Springfield after Springfield, Oregon, the city nearest to Portland where he grew up, but that the show's writers always kept the location deliberately ambiguous, never specifying which state it was in, so that the town could function as an everywhere rather than a somewhere. This was an inspired creative choice because it freed Springfield from the obligations of specific geography while retaining the texture of specific American experience. Springfield can have mountains and an ocean and a desert because it is not a real place constrained by the actual distribution of geological features. It can be a Rust Belt town and a college town and a small agricultural community depending on what the story requires, because its purpose is not documentary realism, but something more useful: the feeling of recognition. Whatever American town you grew up in or lived in or drove through, Springfield contains elements of it. The bar where the same people sit on the same stools every evening. The church with the minister who is trying his best with an underfunded congregation and a lot of complicated people. The school where the teachers range from deeply dedicated to barely functional, and where the line between those categories is not always where you'd expect to find it. The nuclear power plant that is the biggest employer in town and that everyone knows is probably not as safe as the official statements claim. The city hall where local politics plays out at a scale of pettiness and ambition that is both ridiculous and completely recognizable. The mall that is slightly past its prime. The diner that never changes. The bowling alley where men go to feel competent at something in an hour when other things are slipping. These places feel real because they were built with specific details drawn from careful observation of how American communities actually work. The Quick E-Mart, owned and operated by Apu Nahasapi Mapedalon, is not just a convenience store. It is the specific kind of convenience store that exists in mid-size American cities, open at all hours, selling squishies and scratchy lottery tickets and Duff beer and cigarettes, illuminated by fluorescent lights that make everything look slightly ill, manned by someone who knows all of their regular customers by name, but who the regular customers don't fully see as a person. The Quickie Mart has its own smell and its own temperature and its own quality of light, and you know this without being told, because the show built it with enough specificity that your own memory fills in the details the animation leaves out. Moe's Tavern is a masterwork of world building in miniature. It is exactly the kind of bar that exists in every American city. The bar that is not the bar you go to when you want a nice evening, not the trendy bar or the sports bar or the wine bar, but the bar that has been there forever. The bar that smells like it has been absorbing human suffering for decades. The bar where the regulars have their regular spots, and the conversations are circular, and the pretense that anything is going to change has long since been abandoned. Moe is the perfect bartender for this place. Someone who knows everything about his regulars' lives, and uses this knowledge not to help them, but to commiserate with them at a frequency that keeps them coming back. But Moe is more than a bartender type. He is a fully realized person with his own backstory, his own sadnesses, his own unrealized dreams. There is an episode where it is revealed that Moe was once a beloved children's television character who was replaced and has been nursing that wound for decades. There are episodes where Moe falls in love with a depth and a sincerity that makes the comedy of his situation more poignant rather than less. Moe is someone whose entire adult life has been shaped by the specific shape of his failure, and the comedy that comes from him is not the comedy of mocking a loser. It is the comedy of recognizing ourselves in someone who refuses to let his pain stop him from continuing to show up. Springfield Elementary School, presided over by Principal Skinner and populated by teachers of wildly varying competence and commitment, is a portrait of the American public school system that is both unflattering and compassionate. Mrs. Krabappel, voiced by the late Marcia Wallace with a perfect mixture of exhaustion and resilience, is someone who once had ideals about teaching and has had most of them ground away by decades in a system that doesn't support her, and who still occasionally, unexpectedly, does something that reminds you she became a teacher because she cared. When Marcia Wallace died in October 2013, the show retired the character rather than recasting her. The following episode's opening sequence replaced Bart's usual chalkboard gag with a single line, "We'll really miss you, Mrs. K." That tribute said more about the character's place in the world of Springfield than any formal memorial could. Skinner, living in his mother's house and perpetually failing to convince himself that he has not been entirely defeated by his life, is one of the great secondary characters in television history. He is a man of genuine intelligence and genuine limitation, someone who made choices early in his life that have narrowed what is possible for him in ways he can see perfectly clearly but cannot escape. His dignity in the face of this narrowness is both funny and genuinely moving. He maintains the forms of authority and respectability with a precision that becomes tragicomic precisely because everyone, including Skinner himself, knows that the substance behind those forms has long since departed. Montgomery Burns is worth extended attention as a character and as a world-building achievement, because he is simultaneously the show's primary villain and one of its most precisely observed satirical portraits. Burns is old money grown ancient, so disconnected from the everyday realities of other human beings that he sometimes doesn't recognize technologies that have existed for decades. The episode where Burns attempts to buy the presidential election for $1 million and is genuinely confused about why this amount does not purchase what he expected is one of the most sharply pointed pieces of class satire in the show's history. Burns is not evil in a theatrical sense. He is evil in the way that institutional power is evil, casually and without malice, because the people it harms are simply not real to him in the way that his own interests are real. The extended cast of Springfield, ranging from Barney Gumble at the bar to Sideshow Bob in his recurring exile, to groundskeeper Willie raging on the school grounds to Dr. Nick Riviera confidently preparing to perform procedures he does not understand to comic book, Guy sitting in his shop surrounded by the things he loves and using his expertise in them as a shield against the world, is one of the most remarkable ensemble achievements in television history. Each of these characters is fully realized enough to carry an episode. Each of them has an internal logic that would predict their behavior in situations the show has never put them in. Each of them contributes to the sense that Springfield is a complete world, one in which things are happening in every corner even when the cameras are pointed somewhere else. The physical world of Springfield also has a specific quality that contributes to its completeness. The show has mapped the town in enough detail, across enough episodes, that it functions as a real geography even if that geography is occasionally inconsistent. You know where things are relative to each other. You know which streets lead where. You know the look of the neighborhood around 742, Evergreen Terrace, and the feel of the town center around City Hall. The show's animators built backgrounds with a care and a specificity that made Springfield feel inhabited rather than assembled, a place that had existed before the cameras arrived and would continue existing after they left. The world of Family Guy's Rhode Island City is competently built, but thinner. It has recurring locations and recurring secondary characters. Joe Swanson next door, Quagmire on the other side, Meg's school and Chris's school and Peter's brewery, the coffee shop, the bar. These locations are recognizable and functional, but they don't achieve the quality of lived-in completeness that Springfield achieves, because they were never built with the same level of observational specificity or the same commitment to treating the secondary characters as full people with their own rich interior lives. The secondary characters in that show largely function as comedy delivery mechanisms. Joe is primarily there for his disability and its comic implications. Quagmire's entire character is built around a single running joke about his sexuality. Cleveland, who was likable enough to be given his own spin-off series, was primarily defined by his mild-mannered contrast with the louder energy around him, rather than by any deep specificity of his own. These characters are funnier than pure types usually are, and in the early seasons, some of them had genuine moments of depth, but they never achieved the interiority that Springfield's residents achieved. You couldn't construct an episode about Joe Swanson's deepest fear and have it feel organically true to everything the show had established about him the way you could with Mo Sislak or Ned Flanders or Groundskeeper Willie. The world also differs in its attitude toward consequence. Springfield functions, with some notable exceptions, according to an internal logic where things matter. When Maud Flanders dies, the show treats it as a real loss that changes the lives of the characters around her. When Homer's mother returns and leaves again, the show allows the grief of that to land. When Lisa makes a genuine friend, when Bart earns genuine redemption in an episode, the show treats these as real events with real weight. The Family Guy universe has never quite committed to this kind of consequence, partly because the format of the show, with its resets and its disconnected gags, works against the accumulation of consequence. Things happen in Family Guy, but they don't often matter in any lasting way. Springfield is a place where things matter, and that is why it has remained a living world for 35 years, while the Family Guy setting has remained primarily a set. A well-decorated and familiar set, but a set nonetheless. Section 7. What makes a joke last 20 years? There is a famous distinction in comedy between jokes that are about something and jokes that are something. Jokes that are about something have a target, a subject, a reference. They are pointing at something outside themselves and inviting you to find the pointing funny. Jokes that are something are the jokes that contain within themselves the thing they're trying to communicate, that don't refer to a truth external to themselves, but that instantiate the truth directly in the experience of laughing. The best Simpsons jokes are something. They don't just point at working class anxiety or corporate corruption or the particular sadness of mediocrity. They make you feel those things in the act of laughing at them. When Burns says something that reveals his total disconnection from the lived experience of the people whose lives depend on his decisions, the joke is funny because of what it reveals, which is the specific cruelty of powerful people toward the people whose entire lives are organized around serving them. You laugh and you feel it at the same time. The comedy and the recognition arrive simultaneously. A joke that is something in this way does not go stale, because it is not dependent on currency. It is not funny because it references something you currently know. It is funny because it is true about something permanent. The observation doesn't expire, because the thing being observed doesn't change. Corporate power and the disposability of employees, parents and the specific mixture of love and disappointment that flows between them, loneliness dressed as expertise, the way people choose the feeling of progress over the substance of it, these things are as present in the world today as they were in 1993, and so the jokes built on them remain as fresh. The Season 8 episode Homer's Enemy introduces Frank Grimes, a man who has worked his entire life with enormous difficulty to achieve the modest success that Homer stumbled into without effort. The episode is a comedy about the just world fallacy, about the specific rage that comes from watching someone who doesn't deserve good fortune receive it while you, who have done everything right, struggle constantly. Frank Grimes' outrage is funny, and it is also completely understandable, and the episode walks the line between these two things with extraordinary precision. By the end, when Grimes has gone fully unhinged, and the show resolves the situation in the darkest and most surprising way possible, you feel something complicated. Laughter and unease in equal measure, recognition and discomfort that they are both present. That particular feeling, the feeling of a joke that has made you genuinely uncertain about whether to laugh, is one of the most sophisticated effects a comedy can achieve, and The Simpsons achieved it in Season 8. Compare this to the temporal architecture of a joke that depends on cultural currency. Family Guy, particularly in its later seasons, made enormous numbers of jokes that were about specific cultural moments, specific public figures, specific news events that were current at the time of broadcast. Some of these jokes were excellent. Many were sharp and funny in the moment. But a joke about a specific scandal involving a politician whose name most people barely remember from 5 years ago has nothing left to stand on when the currency expires. The reference has become opaque. The target is gone. What remains is the structure of a joke with nothing inside it. The Conway Twitty gag deserves direct attention here because it became one of the most discussed examples of the later show's approach to time. The running bit, which appeared multiple times across several seasons, involved the show simply cutting to a full, unedited performance of the country singer Conway Twitty singing one of his songs. Not a clip, not a parody, a full, real performance played straight, while the audience waited for something to happen. The show presented this as comedy through sheer duration and unexpectedness, betting that the audience would find the refusal to provide a punchline funny in itself. The difference between this and the rake gag from Cape Fear is instructive because both involve repetition and duration, and the show's refusal to stop doing something. The rake gag is funny at beat 1 and funnier by beat 9 because something is happening inside the gag, because the repetition is accumulating into a point about the nature of the commitment. The Conway Twitty gag contains no such internal dynamics. It is just duration. It is the same at the end as at the beginning. There is no accumulation. There is no point being made by the length. The length is the content, and duration without development is not comedy. It is just time passing. Extended comedy, the kind that accumulates across seasons, has an additional requirement beyond the durability of its observations. It requires the jokes to bear weight over time. The setup for a punchline can be placed episodes, seasons, even years in advance if the show has committed to the character depth that makes those setups mean something when the punchline finally arrives. The Simpsons has done this throughout its run, creating running threads of meaning that pay off sometimes many seasons after their introduction. The joke about Homer and Ned Flanders, the neighbor who is everything Homer is not in terms of social propriety and religious virtue, evolves over many seasons from simple, neighborly resentment into something genuinely complex. In the early seasons, Homer's feelings about Flanders are primarily jealousy, the particular resentment of a man who knows he falls short of a standard embodied by someone he has to see every day. Over time, as the show explores both characters more deeply, the relationship develops nuances that make the comedy richer. When Flanders loses his wife Maud in season 11, Homer's grief for his neighbor's grief is genuine, and it is funny in the specific way that moments of unexpected emotional maturity in Homer are always funny. Because you didn't expect it, and because his fumbling attempts at comfort are both inadequate and completely sincere. This is what a show that has built a real world and real people can do. It can take the 30-season investment of the audience in these relationships and cash it in a single moment that means something because of everything it contains. The joke about Homer being bad at comforting Ned is not just a joke about Homer being emotionally clumsy. It is a joke about the entire history of these two men, about all the years of Homer resenting Ned and Ned patiently tolerating Homer, and both of them being, beneath the dynamics of their relationship, people who need each other in ways they would never think to articulate. That is what time does to a great show. It deepens it. Every additional episode adds context that enriches the episodes before it and creates possibilities for the episodes after it. The Family Guy format structurally limits this kind of long-term comic accumulation. A cutaway joke is not building toward anything. It exists in the moment of its delivery and then closes. There is no thread that runs from one cutaway to the next, no sense in which each joke is contributing to a larger comic architecture. This creates a particular viewing experience. High laugh frequency, low retention. You laugh a lot while watching and remember individual moments, but not the episodes themselves as complete objects. The Simpsons episodes, by contrast, are often experienced as complete unified pieces that mean something as wholes, not merely as collections of their best moments. Section 8. The people making the show, why writers' rooms determine everything. The finished television episode you watch on your screen is the endpoint of an enormous number of decisions made by an enormous number of people, but it is not an equally distributed production. Some decisions matter more than others, and the decisions that matter most are made by the fewest people. The question of what a show is about, what its characters believe, how it treats its audience, what it will and will not do in the pursuit of a laugh, these decisions are made by the showrunner and the core writing team, and they determine everything else that follows. Great television writing rooms are rare because they require a specific kind of culture to function. They require writers who are genuinely competitive in their commitment to quality rather than to protecting their own ego or their own jokes. They require a showrunner who is secure enough to be improved by the room rather than threatened by it, who can distinguish between a note that makes the script worse and a note that makes it better. They require a shared understanding of what the show is trying to do, a common language for talking about character and story and tone that allows the room to self-correct when something is going wrong. The Simpsons' Golden Age writing room had this culture in a way that was almost miraculously concentrated. Partly this was because Sam Simon, whatever his personal difficulties with Matt Groening, was a showrunner of genuine brilliance who set a standard for the room that attracted writers of comparable ability. Partly it was because the writers who were drawn to the show in those early seasons were drawn to it specifically because it was doing something unusual, combining comedy and emotional honesty in ways that prestige television comedy of the era didn't do, taking seriously both the craft of making people laugh and the responsibility of making them feel something real. George Meyer, often described by his peers as the sharpest mind in the room during the Golden Age, was known for a particular kind of joke, the joke that was also true. The joke that made you laugh and then made you think, because buried in the absurdity was an observation about the real world that couldn't be denied. Burns trying to buy a presidential election and being genuinely confused about why $1 million doesn't accomplish it. Homer discovering that the key to success is sometimes being too uninformed to know what you're not capable of. Lisa realizing that her intelligence and her gender make her invisible to a system designed for people who are neither. These jokes made you laugh, but they also made you see. And seeing is what you remember. John Swartzwelder wrote 59 episodes of the show, more than any other single writer, and his specific sensibility, a kind of rigorous absurdism that found the logical extension of any premise and then pursued it ruthlessly, shaped the show's comedy in ways that are still visible decades later. Swartzwelder famously wrote in isolation, submitting scripts rather than attending the writer's room, and his scripts were known for their extraordinary density, their internal consistency, and their willingness to take a single premise to places nobody had anticipated. An episode about Homer becoming a Bear Patrol fundraiser becomes an episode about mob justice and free rider problems. An episode about Homer getting a job as a food critic becomes an episode about the specific kind of power that comes with a public platform that your subject has no way to respond to. Conan O'Brien, during his seasons on the show, brought a sensibility shaped by his Harvard Lampoon background that combined absurdism with a gift for musical comedy and a particular affection for historical parody. Marge versus the monorail is the most famous product of his tenure, but Homer's Barbershop Quartet, which tells the story of Homer's brief career as a member of a Beatle-esque vocal group in the 1980s, is equally brilliant. A loving and precise parody of Beatles mythology that works as comedy even for people who don't know the specific moments being parodied. The succession of showrunners after the Golden Age, from Mike Scully through the various incarnations of Al Jean's second run, were professionals of genuine skill, working on a foundation solid enough that the quality of the show, while declining from its peak, never completely collapsed. Mike Scully's seasons 8 through 12 are contested territory, with some fans marking the beginning of the decline there, and others defending individual episodes and even whole seasons within his run as still genuinely excellent. The character of Homer began to drift in Scully's later seasons, becoming somewhat broader and less emotionally nuanced, but the drift was gradual enough that the show remained recognizably itself. Seth MacFarlane's creative role in Family Guy's early seasons was equally personal and equally defining. He had a clear vision, a specific sensibility, a precise sense of what he wanted the show to be. The writers around him in those first 3 seasons were working within a framework he had built, and the quality control he exercised as the primary creative force of the show was real. His personal investment in the characters, his specific comedy sensibility, his sense of when something crossed from funny into merely loud, all of this shaped the show in ways that are visible in the consistency and the quality of the early work. The difficulty is that MacFarlane is one person with many other ambitions and many other projects, and as his attention divided, so did the clarity of the show's creative vision. By his own acknowledgement in various interviews, the constant cancellations and revivals of the show meant that the writing staff was perpetually in flux, constantly being rebuilt after each disruption. The original writers of seasons 1 through 3 scattered during the gap years and were replaced by new writers whose sensibility was shaped by what the show had already been, rather than by the original creative vision. When Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin took over the show-running responsibilities, they were competent television professionals who knew the show intimately. But there is an irreducible difference between knowing a show and having built it. The American Dad comparison is illuminating here, because American Dad was created by MacFarlane at the same time as Family Guy's revival, and it was subjected to a similar process of creative delegation. MacFarlane stepped back from the day-to-day running of American Dad even more completely than he had stepped back from Family Guy, handing creative control to co-creators Mike Barker and Matt Weitzman relatively early in the show's run. And American Dad thrived under this arrangement, becoming, in the assessment of most fans and critics who have followed both shows closely, the better show of the two. The reason is that Barker and Weitzman had their own creative vision for American Dad that was coherent and durable, and that vision proved compatible with and in some ways superior to MacFarlane's original conception. The lesson from American Dad's success is not that MacFarlane's absence is good for his shows. It is that good showrunning requires a coherent creative vision, and that coherent creative vision can come from the person who created a show or from the people who have been trusted to carry it. The Family Guy writing staff in its later seasons had less of a coherent creative vision than the American Dad writing staff did, and this difference showed up in the work. Family Guy became a show performing its own memory of itself, going through motions that had once been driven by genuine creative conviction, producing episodes that were recognizably Family Guy episodes, but that lacked the animating spirit that had made the form worth inhabiting. This is the deepest reason why the decline of Family Guy was more severe and more permanent than the decline of The Simpsons. The Simpsons had a foundation built into its world and its characters that was deeper than any single person's involvement, deep enough that it survived the departure of the Golden Age writers and continued to generate real work even in diminished form. Family Guy's animating spirit was more personal, more concentrated in a single creative consciousness, and when that consciousness turned most of its attention elsewhere, what remained was the visible form of the show without its essential character. Section 9. The legacy question, what it means to matter the way The Simpsons has mattered. There are different ways a piece of art can matter. It can matter commercially, generating large amounts of money and sustaining a profitable enterprise. It can matter culturally, influencing other artists and shaping the vocabulary of a medium. It can matter personally, changing the way individual people understand themselves and the world. And occasionally, very rarely, a piece of art manages to do all three of these things simultaneously, and at a scale that reshapes the landscape it exists in. The Simpsons is one of those rare works. Begin with the commercial dimension. The Simpsons has generated over $1 billion in merchandise sales since its inception. The Simpsons movie, released in July 2007, grossed $527 million worldwide against a production budget of $75 million, making it one of the most profitable animated films of its era relative to cost. The show has been continuously in production for over 35 years, making it the longest-running primetime scripted series in American television history, and it has been renewed at least through season 38. None of this is accidental. Commercial success at this scale and over this duration is the product of sustained cultural relevance, of a show that generation after generation continues to find worth watching and worth buying. But the commercial success is the least interesting dimension of the legacy. Many shows generate large amounts of money without achieving the other dimensions of impact. The Simpsons' commercial success is interesting primarily as an indicator of the scale of cultural penetration it achieved. Culturally, The Simpsons has penetrated the language and the everyday discourse of its era more deeply than any other television program in history, and arguably more deeply than almost any other work of art in the modern era. Homer's grunt of exasperated self-reproach was entered into the Oxford English Dictionary in 2001, defined as expressing frustration at the realization that things have turned out badly or not as planned, or that one has just said or done something foolish. This word sounds like Homer and nobody else. It captures a specific emotional register that had no precise name before he gave it one. Once he named it, English speakers everywhere recognized that they had been looking for this word without knowing they needed it. Meh was added to the Collins English Dictionary in 2008 after the Collins Dictionaries team noted it had been in common usage in print and digital media. The word's popularization through The Simpsons is well documented. Merriam-Webster added cromulent in 2023, 27 years after the word was invented in the Season 7 episode Lisa the Iconoclast, where a minor Springfield official uses it to describe something as perfectly acceptable in a way that parodies official-sounding language. Embiggen followed, entering formal dictionaries because people had been using it unironically in professional contexts, in software development documentation, in academic writing, in everyday conversation. People had absorbed these words so completely that their cartoon origin had become invisible. This kind of linguistic contribution is extraordinarily rare, and it represents something genuine. Words that fill real gaps in expression don't disappear. Meh has been in the language for over 20 years, and it is more useful now than when the show introduced it, because the emotional register it captures, indifference mixed with a mild contempt for the object of indifference, is one of the defining emotional tones of the era it was introduced into. That is not coincidence. The writers of The Simpsons were observing the emotional life of their era with enough precision that they invented vocabulary for it before the wider culture knew the vocabulary was needed. The Simpsons predicted it phenomenon points to something real about the quality of observation the show's writers brought to their work. A season 11 episode from the year 2000 showed Donald Trump as President of the United States. A season 6 episode showed what appeared to be a smartwatch being used as a video phone more than a decade before smartwatches existed. The Disney acquisition of Fox was depicted in a 1998 episode. Various Super Bowl outcomes were predicted in episodes broadcast before the games were played. The show's showrunner Matt Selman has explained this plainly. A show that has been writing about contemporary American life for decades, that is made by writers who study history and social patterns, that is committed to satirizing the tendencies of American culture rather than just observing them, is going to overlap with future events because human nature and institutional behavior follow patterns. The show was observing the patterns. The patterns kept repeating. The overlaps appeared. What the predictions actually demonstrate is not any form of prescience. They demonstrate the depth and the quality of observation that went into the writing. Writers who understand enough about how the world works, who have mapped the tendencies of institutions and culture and human behavior with enough precision, will describe the future, because the future is produced by the same forces they are describing. The Simpsons was not magic. It was just very good at paying attention. The academic impact of the show is also substantial. University courses in philosophy use Simpsons episodes to illustrate ethical concepts. Economics courses have used the show's portrayal of labor relations, corporate behavior, and consumer psychology as case studies. Political science courses have used Springfield as a model for exploring how power operates at the local level. There are multiple published academic books with titles built around The Simpsons and academic disciplines, The Simpsons and philosophy, The Simpsons and economics, The Simpsons and society. These are not pop culture curiosities. They are serious treatments of the show as an object of intellectual inquiry, published by university presses and written by professors who argue that the show offers genuine insight into the subjects they are studying. In 1997, the Peabody Award Committee gave its prize to The Simpsons with the citation that it had provided exceptional animation and stinging social satire, both commodities which are in extremely short supply in television today. This recognition was not given lightly. The Peabody Award is among the most prestigious recognitions in American media, given for work that has made a meaningful contribution to public life, and the committee was saying that The Simpsons' willingness to point at the machinery of American life and expose how it actually works was a genuine public service that went beyond entertainment. The personal dimension of the show's impact is harder to quantify, but is perhaps the most enduring. For millions of people, The Simpsons was the first piece of popular culture that told them the truth about what their lives felt like. It was the first show that depicted a family as it actually is. A family where the parents love each other deeply and also frustrate each other deeply, where the children are sometimes wonderful and sometimes genuinely difficult, where the household functions on love and chaos in roughly equal measure, where nobody is purely right or purely wrong, where every crisis contains both the possibility of disaster and the possibility of connection. For many viewers, watching The Simpsons felt less like entertainment and more like recognition. The show knew what their lives were like, and it found the comedy in all of it without pretending any of it was simple. Family Guy's legacy is real but exists at a different scale and a different depth. The show was genuinely influential on the adult animation marketplace. It demonstrated there was commercial appetite for animated comedy that didn't have to sanitize itself for family viewing. It pioneered a comedy format that influenced other shows and changed the grammar of adult animation. The early seasons produced comedy that influenced a generation of comedy writers who grew up watching and internalizing the structure and the sensibility. But Family Guy did not add words to the dictionary. It did not generate academic books and university courses. It was not honored with Peabody Awards. Its legacy is the legacy of a very successful and influential entertainment property, which is genuinely worth something, but it is not the legacy of a work that changed the air around it, that expanded what was possible, that told people things about themselves that they had been waiting to hear. Section 10. The decline of both shows honesty about what has happened over time. An honest conversation about these two shows must include an honest conversation about decline, because both shows have declined from their peaks. The Simpsons is not the show it was in seasons 3 through 8. Family Guy is not the show it was in seasons 1 through 3. Pretending otherwise would be dishonest, and the case for The Simpsons' superiority doesn't require that kind of dishonesty. In fact, examining the declines carefully actually strengthens the case. Because what each show lost, and how severely it lost, it tells you precisely what each show originally had. The Simpsons' decline began somewhere between Season 8 and Season 12, depending on who you ask and what criteria you use. This is itself a significant fact. The debate about when The Simpsons started declining is a debate about precise gradations across many seasons. Nobody agrees on the exact moment because the decline was gradual and uneven, with brilliant individual episodes continuing to appear scattered through seasons that were overall less consistent than the Golden Age. Mike Reiss himself has noted in interviews that the definition of the Golden Age has been continually revised upward over the years, with seasons that were once dismissed as post-Golden Age being retrospectively welcomed back into the good graces of the fan community as the later seasons became worse. What was once considered a falling off looks, from a sufficient distance, like a plateau. This gradualness, this unevenness, reflects the quality of the foundation the show was built on. A solid foundation doesn't collapse all at once. It shows stress fractures here and there, and some areas hold longer than others, and occasional brilliant moments continue to emerge even from a structure that is no longer performing at its peak. What The Simpsons lost as it aged was primarily density and precision. The show became somewhat slower, with individual episodes containing fewer jokes per minute and those jokes relying more on broad premises than on the precise observation that characterized the Golden Age. The characters became slightly flatter, with Homer in particular developing a broader and less nuanced version of his original self, more purely stupid in some later seasons and less warmed by the genuine love that redeemed his early stupidity. The show became less likely to produce an episode like Lisa's Substitute or Mother Simpson, an episode that would lay bare something true and painful about the human experience, and more likely to produce an episode that was enjoyably funny but that didn't reach for anything more than that. But even in its most criticized later seasons, The Simpsons never produced anything like the character destruction that Family Guy perpetrated on Peter and Brian and Meg across its middle seasons. The worst Homer of the later Simpsons is a somewhat diminished version of the real Homer. The worst Peter of the later Family Guy is someone so different from the Peter of Season 1 that he might as well be a different character wearing Peter's face. The difference in the severity of this transformation reflects the difference in the depth of the original construction. The Simpsons' ratings decline is real and substantial. The show that averaged over 12 million viewers in Season 1, that pulled in 15 and 20 million viewers at its mid-1990s peak, now typically draws somewhere between 1 and 3 million viewers per episode. But this decline must be contextualized. Television viewership as a whole has fragmented dramatically. The proliferation of streaming services, cable channels, YouTube, and other forms of entertainment competing for the same hours of human attention has reduced the audience available to any single show at any single time. A show that gets 2 million broadcast viewers in 2025 is reaching a much larger effective audience than that number suggests, because millions more are watching it on streaming services, through DVR recordings, through social media clips. The Simpsons continues to be renewed because its total viewership across all platforms, combined with its enormous value in reruns and licensing and merchandise, makes it commercially viable in ways that extend far beyond the first-run broadcast numbers. Family Guy's ratings decline is steeper and more revealing. The show averaged 7.9 million viewers in Season 4, which was its revival season in 2005. Season 23, which aired during the 2024 to 2025 television season, averaged 723,000 viewers, a decline of more than 90% from the 2005 figure. The show was moved from Sunday nights, where it had aired for most of its post-revival run, to Wednesday nights starting in the 2023 to 2024 season. In the television industry, being moved from Sunday primetime to Wednesday is a clear signal. Wednesday night is where shows go when the network still wants the revenue from their continued production, but is no longer willing to feature them in the most valuable slots. The character of Family Guy's decline, as opposed to merely its scale, is what reveals the fundamental difference between the two shows. The Simpsons lost quality. Family Guy lost identity. The Simpsons of today is a less impressive version of The Simpsons of 1993, but it is still recognizably the same show, still operating with the same emotional architecture, still producing occasional episodes that access the same emotional register as the Golden Age work. The Family Guy of today is, in significant ways, a different show from the Family Guy of 1999 to 2002, with different character dynamics, different comedy priorities, different emotional textures, different relationships between the family members. A show that loses quality while retaining identity is capable of recovery. The Simpsons has had periods of relative resurgence within its long decline, seasons where the writing was noticeably sharper than in the seasons immediately before them. A show that loses identity along with quality cannot recover in the same way because there is no fixed point to return to. The Family Guy of its latest seasons doesn't have an obvious path back to the Family Guy of its first seasons because the characters who anchored that version of the show have been so thoroughly transformed that the journey would require wholesale reversals rather than simple improvements. This difference is the most important conclusion that emerges from a careful look at what each show has done with time. Time tests, foundations. The Simpsons foundation has held, imperfectly and with significant wear, but held. Family Guy's foundation proved less durable, and the things built on top of it eventually exceeded its capacity to support them. Section 11. What Family Guy got right? A fair accounting of the early brilliance. A case worth making must acknowledge what it's arguing against. It would be easy and intellectually dishonest to construct an argument for The Simpsons' superiority by presenting Family Guy as uniformly bad or as a show that was never genuinely great. It was genuinely great. The early seasons of Family Guy represent a real contribution to the history of animated comedy, a creative achievement that deserves to be acknowledged clearly before the comparison is complete. Seth MacFarlane created Family Guy at the age of 25. He had studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design, had worked at Hanna-Barbera on shows including Dexter's Laboratory and Johnny Bravo, had made 2 short animated films that established the character dynamics that would become Peter and Brian Griffin. He pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998. Fox liked what they saw, and he had a show. He was 25 years old. The confidence and creative vision that comes through in those first 3 seasons is remarkable for someone that young, and the show that resulted from that confidence was genuinely something new. The cutaway gag format, which MacFarlane had been developing as the show's signature, was genuinely innovative and in those early seasons genuinely brilliant. The best early cutaways had qualities that separated them from what the format produced in later years. They were short, landing their joke and moving on before they could overstay their welcome. They were specific, relying on precise details rather than broad references. And they had actual comic content inside them, not just the fact of cutting to something unexpected, but something genuinely funny to discover in the cut. The writing inside the format was sharp enough that the format worked. And the combination of a fresh structure with genuinely good writing produced comedy that felt unlike anything else on television. The characters in the early seasons had genuine appeal. Peter in Season 1 was a lovable fool whose warmth and underlying decency made his constant stupidity charming rather than aggravating. He loved Lois with a sincerity that was both funny and touching. He loved his kids, even when he demonstrated this in ways that were completely unhelpful. The early Peter had what early Homer had, the irreducible core of a good person doing his best with limited equipment. Brian was, in the early seasons, a genuinely original character. A talking dog who was the most sophisticated person in any room he entered, who nursed unrealized dreams of literary significance, who drank martinis and had opinions and served as the voice of reason in a household that desperately needed one. The joke about Brian was never simply that he was a dog. It was that he was the most human person in the family. And the specific quality of his intelligence in those early seasons, which was genuine rather than performative, made him genuinely affecting. Stewie Griffin, as the evil genius baby, was one of the most original character concepts in the history of animated television. A 1-year-old child who spoke with a refined British accent, who built advanced weapons and mind control devices, who had serious plans for world domination and casual contempt for most people around him, while simultaneously navigating the genuine indignities of infancy. This character had no precursor. The contrast between what Stewie looked like and what Stewie said was funny in a way that the show found dozens of new angles on over 3 seasons. The show's early seasons also produced moments of genuine warmth that proved the show was capable of emotional seriousness when it wanted to attempt it. The Season 2 episode Brian in Love, in which Brian discovers that he is actually in love with Lois, handles the comedic premise with a genuine emotional delicacy. Brian's love is unrequitable and he knows it, and the episode doesn't pretend otherwise. It gives him the dignity of genuine feeling rather than reducing the premise to a series of gags. This early treatment of Brian is what makes his later transformation into an insufferable hypocrite so particularly frustrating. The potential was there, clearly visible in those first 3 seasons, for a character of real depth and real emotional resonance, and the show chose not to develop it. The show was also doing something culturally significant in terms of its relationship to internet distribution. Family Guy became one of the most viral shows of the early YouTube era precisely because its cutaway format produced perfect, self-contained clips that could be extracted from the episode and shared online without requiring any context. This made Family Guy enormously influential on the comedy culture of the mid-2000s internet, a period when online video sharing was young and the content that thrived was short, punchy, and self-contained. Millions of people encountered Family Guy clips before they had seen a full episode, and the format's extractability was a feature rather than a bug in this distribution environment. The show's historical achievement of receiving an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009, the first such nomination for an animated program since The Flintstones in 1961, should not be minimized. That nomination reflected a genuine moment of critical recognition, an acknowledgement by the Television Academy that Family Guy at that point in its history was doing something significant enough to be considered alongside the prestige live-action comedies of the era. The early brilliance of Family Guy deserves to be acknowledged clearly and specifically, because it is real and because ignoring it would be intellectually dishonest. The first 3 seasons are, in the areas that the show was best at, genuinely excellent television. Not as deep or as lasting as The Simpsons' golden age, but sharp and funny, and occasionally moving in ways that justified the passion of the fans who refused to let it go quietly when Fox canceled it. The early brilliance makes the later decline more frustrating, because it proves that the people involved were capable of doing things they later stopped doing, that the choices that produced the decline were real choices, and therefore real losses. Section 12. The final case, why The Simpsons wins, and what both shows leave behind. We have been on a long journey together through this quiet night. We have walked through the lobbies where ideas were born, through the writing rooms where they were shaped, through the living rooms of fictional families who felt more real than most real people, through the streets of a fictional town that feels more like America than most actual American towns. We have talked about jokes that last 20 years and jokes that expired in 5. We have talked about what it means to build a foundation versus what it means to rely on a format. We have talked about what heart means in the context of a television show and why its presence or absence determines everything about how long the show matters. Now let's make the final argument clearly, because it deserves to be stated plainly after everything that has come before it. The Simpsons is the better show. The gap between the 2 programs is large, and it is rooted in something specific and permanent rather than in comparative judgments about which show generated more laughs on any given Tuesday evening. The Simpsons built something that no other television show has quite managed to build, a sustained creative universe populated by genuinely complex human beings, a world so specifically realized and so emotionally honest that it continues to generate new meaning even after 35 years of continuous production, a comedy so precisely constructed that its best work remains as funny and as affecting in 2025 as it was in 1993. Family Guy built something real too, something funny and original and influential. It built a comedy format that changed what adult animation could be. It built characters that millions of people loved and recognized themselves in during those early seasons. It built a following passionate enough to resurrect the show twice from cancellation, which has genuinely never happened before or since in American television history. The difference between what each show built comes down to 3 things, and understanding these 3 things is understanding the comparison at its deepest level. The first is intention. The Simpsons was always trying to do more than make you laugh. From the Christmas episode that premiered in December of 1989 to the most recent season, the show has been trying. In every episode and in the accumulation of episodes across decades, to tell you something true about what it feels like to be alive in a working-class American family in the late 20th and early 21st century. Not always successfully, not always brilliantly, but always with the intention that the comedy should be in service of something larger than itself, that the laugh should be accompanied by recognition, that the entertainment should leave something real behind. Family Guy was, for most of its run, trying to make you laugh. This is a legitimate intention, and it is not a lesser one in absolute terms. Making people laugh is one of the great things a human being can do for another human being. But it is a smaller intention than the one that drove The Simpsons, and smaller intentions produce smaller legacies. The second is craft. The Simpsons' Golden Age writing was constructed with a precision and a density and a multi-layered intelligence that represents some of the highest comedy craftsmanship ever applied to a television program. The jokes were built to sustain multiple simultaneous readings. The emotional moments were earned through careful accumulation of character depth over many episodes. The world was built with the specificity of something observed, rather than invented. This level of craft produces work that lasts, because craft is what separates the thing that is good from the thing that merely resembles good. Family Guy's comedy craft in the early seasons was genuine and impressive, but the craft was narrower, more concentrated in a single format, less invested in the sustained emotional construction that makes comedy accumulate into something larger than its parts. And when the creative leadership changed and the pressure for volume increased, the craft declined more severely and more permanently because The Simpsons' broader foundation could absorb some of the loss, while Family Guy's narrower foundation could not. The third is care. The Simpsons, in its golden age, was made by people who cared about the characters they had created, who thought of them as real people with interior lives that deserved to be treated with honesty and respect. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie were not functions. They were people. And the care that the show's writers and producers brought to them is visible in the work, in the way the comedy never forgets what the characters are for, in the way the emotional moments feel earned rather than inserted. Family Guy's care for its characters was always more contingent. In the early seasons, it was real. As the show continued, the care became intermittent, appearing in some episodes and disappearing in others, visible in the occasional brilliant character episode, and absent in the long stretches of content that treated the characters as delivery mechanisms for jokes rather than as people worth protecting. The Simpsons won. It won because it was doing something more ambitious, and it largely succeeded. It was trying to create something lasting from the most perishable medium in existence, something that would still mean something to people who encountered it decades after it was made, something that would pass the test of time not just by surviving it, but by actually accumulating value as it passed through it. Here is the simplest way to say what took so many hours to build toward. 20 years from now, when someone wants to show their child what American family life felt like in this era, what working-class American life felt like, what the specific combination of love and failure and resilience and laughter that makes up an ordinary life looks like when you tell the truth about it, they will put on The Simpsons. Not a clip, an episode. They will sit with the whole thing and let it work on them the way good stories work, and at the end they will understand something real about what it was like to be alive in this time and in this place. Homer sitting on the hood of his car watching the stars will still be beautiful when the youngest person watching this tonight is old. Do It For Her will still mean something when the people who first saw it are long gone. Lisa, small and serious and carrying too much, playing the saxophone in the dark, will still be recognizable to any young person who was ever the smartest and loneliest person in any room. These things do not expire. This is the final, simplest measure of what The Simpsons built. It built things that do not expire. And that is the deepest reason it is the better show, has always been the better show, and will continue to be the better show long after the argument about it has moved on to other conversations. And now you know. Or at least, now you have the full case laid out in front of you. Whether you agree with the conclusion or whether you want to argue for Family Guy's early seasons being closer to The Simpsons' peak than I've given them credit for, either of those conversations is a good one to have. Drop it in the comments. I read them. If this long, quiet night meant something to you, if it gave you the urge to cue up Homer sitting on that car hood and just let it wash over you one more time, then this whole thing did what it was supposed to do. Leave a like if you stayed to the end. Subscribe if you want more nights like this one. Take care of yourselves out there. Get some rest, and I'll see you on the next one. Good night.